The History of Jack the Giant. Killer. In the reign of the famous King Arthur, there lived in Cornwall a lad named Jack, who was a boy of a bold temper, and took delight in hearing or reading of conjurers, giants, and fairies, and used to listen eagerly to the deeds of the knights of King Arthur's Round Table. In those days, there lived on St. Michael's Mount, off Cornwall, a huge giant, 18 feet high and 9 feet round. His fierce and savage looks were the terror of all who beheld him. He dwelt in a gloomy cavern on the top of the mountain, and used to wade over to the mainland in search of prey, when he would throw 6 oxen upon his back, and tie 3 times as many sheep and hogs round his waist, and march back to his own abode. The giant had done this for many years when Jack resolved to destroy him. Jack took a horn, a shovel, a pickaxe, his armor, and a dark lantern. And one winter's evening he went to the mount. There he dug a pit 22 feet deep and 20 broad. He covered the top over so as to make it look like solid ground. He then blew his horn so loudly that the giant awoke and came out of his den crying out, "You saucy villain! You shall pay for this. I'll broil you for my breakfast." He had just finished when, taking one step further, he tumbled headlong into the pit, and Jack struck him a blow on the head with his pickaxe, which killed him. Jack then returned home to cheer his friends with the news. Another giant, called Blunderbore, vowed to be revenged on Jack if ever he should have him in his power. This giant kept an enchanted castle in the midst of a lonely wood, and some time after the death of Cormoran Jack was passing through a wood, and being weary sat down and went to sleep. The giant, passing by and seeing Jack, carried him to his castle, where he locked him up in a large room, the floor of which was covered with the bodies, skulls, and bones of men and women. Soon after, the giant went to fetch his brother, who was likewise a giant, to take a meal off his flesh, and Jack saw with terror through the bars of his prison the 2 giants approaching. Jack, perceiving in one corner of the room a strong cord, took courage, and making a slip knot at each end, he threw them over their heads and tied it to the window bars. He then pulled till he had choked them. When they were black in the face, he slid down the rope and stabbed them to the heart. Jack next took a great bunch of keys from the pocket of Blunderbore, and went into the castle again. He made a strict search through all the rooms, and in one of them found 3 ladies tied up by the hair of their heads, and almost starved to death. They told him that their husbands had been killed by the giants, who had then condemned them to be starved to death because they would not eat the flesh of their own dead husbands. "Ladies," said Jack, "I have put an end to the monster and his wicked brother, and I give you this castle, and all the riches it contains, to make some amends for the dreadful pains you have felt." He then very politely gave them the keys of the castle, and went further on his journey to Wales. As Jack had but little money, he went on as fast as possible. At length he came to a handsome house. Jack knocked at the door, when there came forth a Welsh giant. Jack said he was a traveller who had lost his way, on which the giant made him welcome, and let him into a room where there was a good bed to sleep in. Jack took off his clothes quickly, but though he was weary, he could not go to sleep. Soon after this he heard the giant walking backward and forward in the next room, and saying to himself, "Though here you lodge with me this night, you shall not see the morning light. My club shall dash your brains out quite." "Say you so?" thought Jack. "Are these your tricks upon travellers? But I hope to prove as cunning as you are." Then, getting out of bed, he groped about the room, and at last found a large, thick billet of wood. He laid it in his own place in the bed, and then hid himself in a dark corner of the room. The giant, about midnight, entered the apartment, and with his bludgeon struck many blows on the bed, in the very place where Jack had laid the log, and then he went back to his own room, thinking he had broken all Jack's bones. Early in the morning Jack put a bold face upon the matter, and walked into the giant's room to thank him for his lodging. The giant started when he saw him, and began to stammer out, "Oh, dear me, is it you? Pray, how did you sleep last night? Did you hear or see anything in the dead of the night?" "Nothing to speak of," said Jack carelessly. "A rat, I believe, gave me 3 or 4 slaps with its tail, and disturbed me a little, but I soon went to sleep again." The giant wondered more and more at this, yet he did not answer a word, but went to bring 2 great bowls of hasty pudding for their breakfast. Jack wanted to make the giant believe that he could eat as much as himself, so he contrived to button a leathern bag inside his coat, and slip the hasty pudding into this bag, while he seemed to put it into his mouth. When breakfast was over, he said to the giant, "Now I will show you a fine trick. I can cure all wounds with a touch. I could cut off my head in 1 minute, and the next put it sound again on my shoulders. You shall see an example." He then took hold of the knife, ripped up the leathern bag, and all the hasty pudding tumbled out upon the floor. "Odd splutter her nails!" cried the Welsh giant, who was ashamed to be outdone by such a little fellow as Jack. "Her can do that herself." So he snatched up the knife, plunged it into his own stomach, and in a moment dropped down dead. Jack, having hitherto been successful in all his undertakings, resolved not to be idle in future. He therefore furnished himself with a horse, a cap of knowledge, a sword of sharpness, shoes of swiftness, and an invisible coat, the better to perform the wonderful enterprises that lay before him. He travelled over high hills, and on the 3rd day he came to a large and spacious forest, through which his road lay. Scarcely had he entered the forest, when he beheld a monstrous giant dragging along by the hair of their heads a handsome knight and his lady. Jack alighted from his horse, and tying him to an oak tree, put on his invisible coat, under which he carried his sword of sharpness. When he came up to the giant, he made several strokes at him, but could not reach his body, but wounded his thighs in several places, and at length, putting both hands to his sword, and aiming with all his might, he cut off both his legs. Then Jack, setting his foot upon his neck, plunged his sword into the giant's body, when the monster gave a groan and expired. The knight and his lady thanked Jack for their deliverance, and invited him to their house to receive a proper reward for his services. "No," said Jack, "I cannot be easy till I find out this monster's habitation." So, taking the knight's directions, he mounted his horse, and soon after came in sight of another giant, who was sitting on a block of timber, waiting for his brother's return. Jack alighted from his horse, and, putting on his invisible coat, approached and aimed a blow at the giant's head, but, missing his aim, he only cut off his nose. On this the giant seized his club and laid about him most unmercifully. "Nay," said Jack, "if this be the case, I'd better dispatch you." So, jumping upon the block, he stabbed him in the back, when he dropped down dead. Jack then proceeded on his journey, and travelled over hills and dales, till arriving at the foot of a high mountain, he knocked at the door of a lonely house, when an old man let him in. When Jack was seated, the hermit thus addressed him: "My son, on the top of this mountain is an enchanted castle, kept by the giant Galligantus and a vile magician. I lament the fate of a duke's daughter, whom they seized as she was walking in her father's garden, and brought hither transformed into a deer." Jack promised that in the morning, at the risk of his life, he would break the enchantment, and after a sound sleep he rose early, put on his invisible coat, and got ready for the attempt. When he had climbed to the top of the mountain, he saw 2 fiery griffins, but he passed between them without the least fear of danger, for they could not see him because of his invisible coat. On the castle gate he found a golden trumpet, under which were written these lines: "Whoever can this trumpet blow shall cause the giant's overthrow." As soon as Jack had read this, he seized the trumpet and blew a shrill blast, which made the gates fly open and the very castle itself tremble. The giant and the conjurer now knew that their wicked course was at an end, and they stood biting their thumbs and shaking with fear. Jack, with his sword of sharpness, soon killed the giant, and the magician was then carried away by a whirlwind, and every knight and beautiful lady who had been changed into birds and beasts returned to their proper shapes. The castle vanished away like smoke, and the head of the giant, Galligantus, was then sent to King Arthur. The knights and ladies rested that night at the old man's hermitage, and next day they set out for the court. Jack then went up to the king and gave his majesty an account of all his fierce battles. Jack's fame had now spread through the whole country, and at the king's desire the duke gave him his daughter in marriage, to the joy of all his kingdom. After this the king gave him a large estate, on which he and his lady lived the rest of their days in joy and contentment. The History of Whittington. Dick Whittington was a very little boy when his father and mother died, so little indeed that he never knew them, nor the place where he was born. He strolled about the country as ragged as a colt, till he met with a waggoner who was going to London, and who gave him leave to walk all the way by the side of his waggon without paying anything for his passage. This pleased little Whittington very much, as he wanted to see London sadly, for he had heard that the streets were paved with gold, and he was willing to get a bushel of it. But how great was his disappointment, poor boy, when he saw the streets covered with dirt instead of gold, and found himself in a strange place, without a friend, without food, and without money. Though the waggoner was so charitable as to let him walk up by the side of the waggon for nothing, he took care not to know him when he came to town, and the poor boy was, in a little time, so cold and hungry that he wished himself in a good kitchen and by a warm fire in the country. In his distress he asked charity of several people, and one of them bid him go to work for an idle rogue. "That I will," said Whittington. "With all my heart I will work for you if you will let me." The man, who thought this savoured of wit and impertinence, though the poor lad intended only to show his readiness to work, gave him a blow with a stick which broke his head so that the blood ran down. In this situation, and fainting for want of food, he laid himself down at the door of one Mr. Fitzwarren, a merchant, where the cook saw him, and, being an ill-natured hussy, ordered him to go about his business, or she would scold him. At this time Mr. Fitzwarren came from the exchange, and began also to scold at the poor boy, bidding him to go to work. Whittington answered that he should be glad to work if anybody would employ him, and that he should be able if he could get some victuals to eat, for he had had nothing for 3 days, and he was a poor country boy and knew nobody, and nobody would employ him. He then endeavoured to get up, but he was so very weak that he fell down again, which excited so much compassion in the merchant that he ordered the servants to take him in and give him some meat and drink, and let him help the cook to do any dirty work that she had to set him about. People are too apt to reproach those who beg with being idle, but give themselves no concern to put them in the way of getting business to do, or considering whether they are able to do it, which is not charity. But we return to Whittington, who could have lived happy in this worthy family had he not been bumped about by the cross cook, who must be always roasting and basting, or when the spit was idle, employed her hands upon poor Whittington. At last Miss Alice, his master's daughter, was informed of it, and then she took compassion on the poor boy, and made the servants treat him kindly. Besides the crossness of the cook, Whittington had another difficulty to get over before he could be happy. He had, by order of his master, a flock bed placed for him in a garret, where there was a number of rats and mice that often ran over the poor boy's nose and disturbed him in his sleep. After some time, however, a gentleman who came to his master's house gave Whittington a penny for brushing his shoes. This he put into his pocket, being determined to lay it out to the best advantage, and the next day, seeing a woman in the street with a cat under her arm, he ran up to know the price of it. The woman, as the cat was a good mouser, asked a deal of money for it, but on Whittington's telling her he had but a penny in the world, and that he wanted a cat sadly, she let him have it. This cat Whittington concealed in the garret, for fear she should be beat about by his mortal enemy, the cook, and here she soon killed or frightened away the rats and mice, so that the poor boy could now sleep as sound as a top. Soon after this, the merchant, who had a ship ready to sail, called for his servants, as his custom was, in order that each of them might venture something to try their luck, and whatever they sent was to pay neither freight nor custom, for he thought justly that God Almighty would bless him the more for his readiness to let the poor partake of his fortune. All the servants appeared, but poor Whittington, who, having neither money nor goods, could not think of sending anything to try his luck, but his good friend Miss Alice, thinking his poverty kept him away, ordered him to be called. She then offered to lay down something for him, but the merchant told his daughter that would not do, it must be something of his own, upon which poor Whittington said he had nothing but a cat, which he bought for a penny that was given him. "Fetch thy cat, boy," said the merchant, "and send her." Whittington brought poor puss, and delivered her to the captain with tears in his eyes, for he said he should now be disturbed by the rats and mice as much as ever. All the company laughed at the adventure, but Miss Alice, who pitied the poor boy, and gave him something to buy another cat. While puss was beating the billows at sea, poor Whittington was severely beaten at home by his tyrannical mistress, the cook, who used him so cruelly, and made such game of him for sending his cat to sea, that at last the poor boy determined to run away from his place, and having packed up the few things he had, he set out very early in the morning on All Hallows Day. He travelled as far as Holloway, and there sat down on a stone to consider what course he should take. But while he was thus ruminating, Bow bells, of which there were only 6, began to ring, and he thought their sounds addressed him in this manner: "Turn again, Whittington, thrice Lord Mayor of London." "Lord Mayor of London," said he to himself, "what would not one endure to be Lord Mayor of London, and ride in such a fine coach? Well, I'll go back again, and bear all the pummelling and ill usage of Sicily rather than miss the opportunity of being Lord Mayor." So home he went, and happily got into the house and about his business before Mrs. Cicely made her appearance. We must now follow Miss Puss to the coast of Africa. How perilous are voyages at sea! How uncertain the winds and the waves, and how many accidents attend a naval life! The ship that had the cat on board was long beaten at sea, and at last, by contrary winds, driven on a part of the coast of Barbary which was inhabited by Moors unknown to the English. These people received our countrymen with civility, and therefore the captain, in order to trade with them, showed them the patterns of the goods he had on board, and sent some of them to the king of the country, who was so well pleased that he sent for the captain and the factor to come to his palace, which was about a mile from the sea. Here they were placed, according to the custom of the country, on rich carpets, flowered with gold and silver, and the king and queen being seated at the upper end of the room, dinner was brought in, which consisted of many dishes, but no sooner were the dishes put down, but an amazing number of rats and mice came from all quarters, and devoured all the meat in an instant. The factor, in surprise, turned round to the nobles and asked if these vermin were not offensive. "Oh, yes," said they, "very offensive, and the king would give half his treasure to be freed of them. For they not only destroy his dinner, as you see, but they assault him in his chamber, and even in bed, so that he is obliged to be watched while he is sleeping, for fear of them." The factor jumped for joy. He remembered poor Whittington and his cat, and told the king he had a creature on board the ship that would dispatch all these vermin immediately. The king's heart heaved so high at the joy which this news gave him that his turban dropped off his head. "Bring this creature to me," said he. "Vermin are dreadful in a court, and if she will perform what you say, I will load your ship with gold and jewels in exchange for her." The factor, who knew his business, took this opportunity to set forth the merits of Miss Puss. He told His Majesty that it would be inconvenient to part with her, as, when she was gone, the rats and mice might destroy the goods in the ship, but to oblige His Majesty he would fetch her. "Run, run," said the Queen. "I am impatient to see the dear creature." Away flew the factor, while another dinner was providing, and returned with the cat just as the rats and mice were devouring that also. He immediately put down Miss Puss, who killed a great number of them. The king rejoiced greatly to see his old enemies destroyed by so small a creature, and the queen was highly pleased, and desired the cat might be brought near that she might look at her, upon which the factor called, "Pussy, Pussy, Pussy," and she came to him. He then presented her to the queen, who started back, and was afraid to touch a creature who had made such havoc among the rats and mice. However, when the factor stroked the cat and called, "Pussy, Pussy," the queen also touched her and cried, "Putty, Putty," for she had not learned English. He then put her down on the queen's lap, where she, purring, played with Her Majesty's hand, and then sang herself to sleep. The king, having seen the exploits of Miss Puss, and being informed that her kittens would stock the whole country, bargained with the captain and factor for the whole ship's cargo, and then gave them 10 times as much for the cat as all the rest amounted to. On which, taking leave of their majesties and other great personages at court, they sailed with a fair wind for England, whither we must now attend them. The morn had scarcely dawned when Mr. Fitzwarren arose to count over the cash, and settle the business for that day. He had just entered the counting-house, and seated himself at the desk, when somebody came. Tap, tap, at the door. "Who's there?" said Mr. Fitzwarren. "A friend," answered the other. "What friend can come at this unseasonable time?" "A real friend is never unseasonable," answered the other. "I come to bring you good news of your ship, Unicorn." The merchant bustled up in such a hurry that he forgot his gout, instantly opened the door, and who should be seen waiting but the captain and factor, with a cabinet of jewels and a bill of lading, for which the merchant lifted up his eyes and thanked heaven for sending him such a prosperous voyage. Then they told him the adventures of the cat, and showed him the cabinet of jewels which they had brought for Mr. Whittington. Upon which he cried out with great earnestness, but not in the most poetical manner, "Go! Send him in, and tell him of his fame, and call him Mr. Whittington by name." It is not our business to animadvert upon these lines. We are not critics, but historians. It is sufficient for us that they are the words of Mr. Fitzwarren, and though it is beside our purpose, and perhaps not in our power to prove him a good poet, we shall soon convince the reader that he was a good man, which was a much better character. For when some who were present told him that this treasure was too much for such a poor boy as Whittington, he said, "God forbid that I should deprive him of a penny. It is his own, and he shall have it to a farthing." He then ordered Mr. Whittington in, who was at this time cleaning the kitchen, and would have excused himself from going into the counting-house, saying the room was swept and his shoes were dirty and full of hobnails. The merchant, however, made him come in, and ordered a chair to be set for him. Upon which, thinking they intended to make sport of him, as had been too often the case in the kitchen, he besought his master not to mock a poor simple fellow who intended them no harm, but let him go about his business. The merchant, taking him by the hand, said, "Indeed, Mr. Whittington, I am in earnest with you, and sent for you to congratulate you on your great success. Your cat has procured you more money than I am worth in the world, and may you long enjoy it and be happy." At length, being shown the treasure, and convinced by them that all of it belonged to him, he fell upon his knees and thanked the Almighty for his providential care of such a poor and miserable creature. He then laid all the treasure at his master's feet, who refused to take any part of it, but told him he heartily rejoiced at his prosperity, and hoped the wealth he had acquired would be a comfort to him, and would make him happy. He then applied to his mistress and to his good friend Miss Alice, who refused to take any part of the money, but told him she heartily rejoiced at his good success and wished him all imaginable felicity. He then gratified the captain, factor, and the ship's crew for the care they had taken of his cargo. He likewise distributed presents to all the servants in the house, not forgetting even his old enemy the cook, though she little deserved it. After this, Mr. Fitzwarren advised Mr. Whittington to send for the necessary people, and dress himself like a gentleman, and made him the offer of his house to live in, till he could provide himself with a better. Now it came to pass, when Mr. Whittington's face was washed, his hair curled, and he dressed in a rich suit of clothes, that he turned out a genteel young fellow, and, as wealth contributes much to give a man confidence, he in a little time dropped that sheepish behaviour which was principally occasioned by a depression of spirits, and soon grew a sprightly and good companion, insomuch that Miss Alice, who had formerly pitied him, now fell in love with him. When her father perceived they had this good liking for each other, he proposed a match between them, to which both parties cheerfully consented, and the Lord Mayor, Court of Aldermen, Sheriffs, the Company of Stationers, the Royal Academy of Arts, and a number of eminent merchants attended the ceremony, and were elegantly treated at an entertainment made for that purpose. History further relates that they lived very happy, had several children, and died at a good old age. Mr. Storr, Whittington served as Sheriff of London and was 3 times Lord Mayor. In the last year of his mayoralty he entertained King Henry V and his Queen, after his conquest of France, upon which occasion the King, in consideration of Whittington's merit, said, "Never had Prince such a subject," which being told to Whittington at the table, he replied, "Never had subject such a king." His Majesty, out of respect to his good character, conferred the honour of knighthood on him soon after. Sir Richard, many years before his death, constantly fed a great number of poor citizens, built a church and a college to it, with a yearly allowance for poor scholars, and near it erected a hospital. He also built Newgate for criminals, and gave liberally to St. Bartholomew's Hospital and other public charities. The Master-Maid. Once upon a time there was a king who had many sons. I do not exactly know how many there were, but the youngest of them could not stay quietly at home, and was determined to go out into the world and try his luck, and after a long time the king was forced to give him leave to go. When he had travelled about for several days, he came to a giant's house, and hired himself to the giant as a servant. In the morning the giant had to go out to pasture his goats, and as he was leaving the house he told the king's son that he must clean out the stable. "And after you have done that," he said, You need not do any more work today, for you have come to a kind master, and that you shall find. But what I set you to do must be done both well and thoroughly, and you must on no account go into any of the rooms which lead out of the room in which you slept last night. If you do, I will take your life." "Well, to be sure, he is an easy master," said the prince to himself as he walked up and down the room humming and singing, for he thought there would be plenty of time left to clean out the stable. "But it would be amusing to steal a glance into his other rooms as well," thought the prince, "for there must be something that he is afraid of my seeing, as I am not allowed to enter them." So he went into the first room. A cauldron was hanging from the walls. It was boiling, but the prince could see no fire under it. "I wonder what is inside it," he thought, and dipped a lock of his hair in, and the hair became just as if it were all made of copper. "That's a nice kind of soup. If anyone were to taste that his throat would be gilded," said the youth, and then he went into the next chamber. There, too, a cauldron was hanging from the wall, bubbling and boiling, but there was no fire under this either. "I will just try what this is like too," said the prince, thrusting another lock of his hair into it, and it came out silvered over. "Such costly soup is not to be had in my father's palace," said the prince, "but everything depends on how it tastes." And then he went into the third room. There, too, a cauldron was hanging from the wall, boiling, exactly the same as in the two other rooms, and the prince took pleasure in trying this also, so he dipped a lock of hair in, and it came out so brightly gilded that it shone again. "Some talk about going from bad to worse," said the prince, "but this is better and better. If he boils gold here, what can he boil in there?" He was determined to see, and went through the door into the fourth room. No cauldron was to be seen there, but on a bench someone was seated who was like a king's daughter. But whosoever she was so beautiful that never in the prince's life had he seen her equal. "Oh, in heaven's name, what are you doing here?" said she who sat upon the bench. "I took the place of servant here yesterday," said the prince. "May you soon have a better place, if you have come to serve here," said she. "Oh, but I think I have got a kind master," said the prince. "He has not given me hard work to do today. When I have cleaned out the stable, I shall be done." "Yes, but how will you be able to do that?" she asked again. "If you clean it out as other people do, 10 pitchforks full will come in for everyone you throw out. But I will teach you how to do it. You must turn your pitchfork upside down and work with the handle, and then all will fly out of its own accord." "Yes, I will attend to that," said the prince, and stayed sitting where he was the whole day, for it was soon settled between them that they would marry each other, he and the king's daughter. So the first day of his service with the giant did not seem long to him. But when evening was drawing near, she said that it would now be better for him to clean out the stable before the giant came home. When he got there, he had a fancy to try if what she had said were true. So he began to work in the same way that he had seen the stable boys doing in his father's stables. But he soon saw that he must give up that, for when he had worked a very short time, he had scarcely any room left to stand. So he did what the princess had taught him, turned the pitchfork round, and worked with the handle. And in the twinkling of an eye, the stable was as clean as if it had been scoured. When he had done that, he went back again into the room in which the giant had given him leave to stay, and there he walked backward and forward on the floor, and began to hum and sing. Then came the giant home with the goats. "Have you cleaned the stable?" asked the giant. "Yes, now it is clean and sweet, master," said the king's son. "I shall see about that," said the giant, and went round to the stable. But it was just as the prince had said. "You have certainly been talking to my master-maid, for you never got that out of your own head," said the giant. "Master-maid, "What kind of a thing is that, master?" said the prince, making himself look as stupid as an ass. "I should like to see that." "Well, you will see her quite soon enough," said the giant. On the second morning, the giant had again to go out with his goats, so he told the prince that on that day he was to fetch home his horse, which was out on the mountainside, and when he had done that he might rest himself for the remainder of the day, "for you have come to a kind master, and that you shall find," said the giant once more. "But do not go into any of the rooms that I spoke of yesterday, or I will wring your head off," said he, and then went away with his flock of goats. "Yes, indeed, you are a kind master," said the prince, "but I will go in and talk to the Master-Maid again. Perhaps before long she may like better to be mine than yours." So he went to her. Then she asked him what he had to do that day. "Oh, not very dangerous work, I fancy," said the king's son. "I have only to go up the mountainside after his horse." "Well, how do you mean to set about it?" asked the Master-Maid. "Oh, there is no great art in riding a horse home," said the king's son. "I think I must have ridden friskier horses before now." "Yes, but it is not so easy a thing as you think to ride the horse home," said the Master-Maid. "But I will teach you what to do. When you go near it, fire will burst out of its nostrils like flames from a pine torch. But be very careful and take the bridle which is hanging by the door there, and fling the bit straight into his jaws, and then it will become so tame that you will be able to do what you like with it." He said he would bear this in mind, and then he again sat in there the whole day by the Master-Maid, and they chatted and talked of one thing and another. But the first thing and the last now was, how happy and delightful it would be if they could but marry each other, and get safely away from the giant. And the prince would have forgotten both the mountainside and the horse if the Master-Maid had not reminded him of them, as evening drew near, and said that now it would be better if he went to fetch the horse before the giant came. So he did this, and took the bridle which was hanging on a crook, and strode up the mountainside, and it was not long before he met with the horse, and fire and red flames streamed forth out of its nostrils. But the youth carefully watched his opportunity, and just as it was rushing at him with open jaws, he threw the bit straight into its mouth, and the horse stood as quiet as a young lamb, and there was no difficulty at all in getting it home to the stable. Then the prince went back into his room again, and began to hum and to sing. Toward evening the giant came home. "Have you fetched the horse back from the mountainside?" he asked. "That I have, master. It was an amusing horse to ride, but I rode him straight home and put him in the stable too," said the prince. "I will see about that," said the giant, and went out to the stable. But the horse was standing there just as the prince had said. "You have certainly been talking with my Master-Maid, for you never got that out of your own head," said the giant again. "Yesterday, master, you talked about this Master-Maid, and today you are talking about her. Ah, heaven bless you, master, why will you not show me the thing?" "For it would be a real pleasure to me to see it," said the prince, who again pretended to be silly and stupid. "Oh, you will see her quite soon enough," said the giant. On the morning of the third day, the giant again had to go into the wood with the goats. "Today you must go underground and fetch my taxes," he said to the prince. "When you have done this, you may rest for the remainder of the day, for you shall see what an easy master you have come to." And then he went away. "Well, however easy a master you may be, you set me very hard work to do," thought the prince. "But I will see if I cannot find your Master-Maid. You say she is yours, but for all that she may be able to tell me what to do now." And he went back to her. So, when the Master-Maid asked him what the giant had set him to do that day, he told her that he was to go underground and get the taxes. "And how will you set about that?" said the Master-Maid. "Oh, you must tell me how to do it," said the prince. "For I have never yet been underground, and even if I knew the way, I do not know how much I am to demand." "Oh, yes, I will soon tell you that. You must go to the rock there under the mountain ridge, and take the club that is there and knock on the rocky wall," said the Master-Maid. "Then someone will come out who will sparkle with fire. You shall tell him your errand, and when he asks you how much you want to have, you are to say, 'As much as I can carry.'" "Yes, I will keep that in mind," said he, and then he sat there with the Master-Maid the whole day, until night drew near, and he would gladly have stayed there till now, if the Master-Maid had not reminded him that it was time to be off to fetch the taxes before the giant came. So he set out on his way and did exactly what the Master-Maid had told him. He went to the rocky wall and took the club and knocked on it. Then came one so full of sparks that they flew both out of his eyes and his nose. "What do you want?" said he. "I was to come here for the giant, and demand the tax for him," said the king's son. "How much are you to have then?" said the other. "I ask for no more than I am able to carry with me," said the prince. "It is well for you that you have not asked for a horse-load," said he who had come out of the rock. "But now come in with me." This the prince did, and what a quantity of gold and silver he saw! It was lying inside the mountain like heaps of stones in a waste place, and he got a load that was as large as he was able to carry, and with that he went his way. So, in the evening, when the giant came home with the goats, the prince went into the chamber and hummed and sang again, as he had done on the other 2 evenings. "Have you been for the tax?" said the giant. "Yes." "That I have, master," said the prince. "Where have you put it then?" said the giant again. "The bag of gold is standing there on the bench," said the prince. "I will see about that," said the giant, and went away to the bench. But the bag was standing there, and it was so full that gold and silver dropped out when the giant untied the string.
"You have certainly been talking with my Master-Maid,"
said the giant, "and if you have, I will wring your neck." "Master-Maid?" said the prince. "Yesterday my master talked about this. Master-Maid, and today he is talking about her again. And the first day of all, it was talk of the same kind." "I do wish I could see the thing myself," said he. "Yes, yes, wait till tomorrow," said the giant, "and then I myself will take you to her." "Ah, master, I thank you." "But you are only mocking me," said the king's son. Next day the giant took him to the Master-Maid. "Now you shall kill him, and boil him in the great big cauldron you know of, and when you have got the broth ready, give me a call," said the giant. Then he lay down on the bench to sleep, and almost immediately began to snore, so that it sounded like thunder among the hills. So the Master-Maid took a knife, and cut the prince's little finger, and dropped 3 drops of blood upon a wooden stool. Then she took all the old rags and shoe soles, and all the rubbish she could lay hands on, and put them in the cauldron, and then she filled a chest with gold dust, and a lump of salt, and a water flask which was hanging by the door, and she also took with her a golden apple, and 2 gold chickens. And then she and the prince went away with all the speed they could, and when they had gone a little way, they came to the sea, and then they sailed. But where they got the ship from, I have never been able to learn. Now, when the giant had slept a good long time, he began to stretch himself on the bench on which he was lying. "Will it soon boil?" said he. "It is just beginning," said the first drop of blood on the stool. So the giant lay down to sleep again, and slept for a long, long time. Then he began to move about a little again. "Will it soon be ready now?" said he. But he did not look up this time any more than he had done the first time, for he was still half asleep. "Half done!" said the second drop of blood, and the giant believed it was the Master-Maid again, and turned himself on the bench and lay down to sleep once more. When he had slept again for many hours, he began to move and stretch himself. "Is it not done yet?" said he. "It is quite ready," said the third drop of blood. Then the giant began to sit up and rub his eyes, but he could not see who it was who had spoken to him. So he asked for the Master-Maid, and called her, but there was no one to give him an answer. "Ah, well, she has just stolen out for a little," thought the giant, and he took a spoon and went off to the cauldron to have a taste. But there was nothing in it but shoe soles and rags and such trumpery as that, and all was boiled up together, so that he could not tell whether it was porridge or milk pottage. When he saw this, he understood what had happened, and fell into such a rage that he hardly knew what he was doing. Away he went after the prince and the Master-Maid, so fast that the wind whistled behind him, and it was not long before he came to the water, but he could not get over it. "Well, well, I will soon find a cure for that. I have only to call my river-sucker," said the giant, and he did call him. So his river-sucker came and lay down and drank 1, 2, 3 draughts, and with that the water in the sea fell so low that the giant saw the Master-Maid and the prince out on the sea in their ship. "Now you must throw out the lump of salt," said the Master-Maid. And the prince did so, and it grew up into such a great high mountain right across the sea that the giant could not come over it, and the river-sucker could not drink any more water. "Well, well, I will soon find a cure for that," said the giant. So he called to his hill-borer to come and bore through the mountain, so that the river-sucker might be able to drink up the water again. But just as the hole was made, and the river-sucker was beginning to drink, the Master-Maid told the prince to throw 1 or 2 drops out of the flask, and when he did this the sea instantly became full of water again, and before the river-sucker could take 1 drink, they reached the land and were in safety. So they determined to go home to the prince's father, but the prince would on no account permit the Master-Maid to walk there, for he thought that it was unbecoming either for her or for him to go on foot. "Wait here the least little bit of time, while I go home for the 7 horses which stand in my father's stable," said he. "It is not far off, and I shall not be long away, but I will not let my betrothed bride go on foot to the palace. Oh, no, do not go, for if you go home to the king's palace you will forget me. I foresee that." "How could I forget you? We have suffered so much evil together, and love each other so much," said the prince, and he insisted on going home for the coach with the 7 horses, and she was to wait for him there by the seashore. So at last the Master-Maid had to yield, for he was so absolutely determined to do it. "But when you get there you must not even give yourself time to greet anyone, but go straight into the stable, and take the horses, and put them in the coach, and drive back as quickly as you can. For they will all come round about you, but you must behave just as if you did not see them, and on no account must you taste anything. For if you do, it will cause great misery both to you and to me," said she, and this he promised. But when he got home to the king's palace, one of his brothers was just going to be married, and the bride and all her kith and kin had come to the palace, so they all thronged round him, and questioned him about this and that, and wanted him to go in with them. But he behaved as if he did not see them, and went straight to the stable, and got out the horses, and began to harness them. When they saw that they could not by any means prevail on him to go in with them, they came out to him with meat and drink, and the best of everything that they had prepared for the wedding. But the prince refused to touch anything, and would do nothing but put the horses in as quickly as he could. At last, however, the bride's sister rolled an apple across the yard to him, and said, "As you won't eat anything else, you may like to take a bite of that, for you must be both hungry and thirsty after your long journey." And he took up the apple and bit a piece out of it. But no sooner had he got the piece of apple in his mouth than he forgot the Master-Maid, and that he was to go back in the coach to fetch her. "I think I must be mad. What do I want with this coach and horses?" said he, and then he put the horses back into the stable, and went into the king's palace, and there it was settled that he should marry the bride's sister, who had rolled the apple to him. The Master-Maid sat by the seashore for a long, long time, waiting for the prince, but no prince came. So she went away, and when she had walked a short distance, she came to a little hut which stood all alone in a small wood hard by the king's palace. She entered it and asked if she might be allowed to stay there. The hut belonged to an old crone, who was also an ill-tempered and malicious troll. At first she would not let the Master-Maid remain with her, but at last, after a long time, by means of good words and good payment, she obtained leave. But the hut was as dirty and black inside as a pigsty, so the Master-Maid said that she would smarten it up a little, that it might look a little more like what other people's houses looked inside. The old crone did not like this either. She scowled and was very cross, but the Master-Maid did not trouble herself about that. She took out her chest of gold and flung a handful of it or so into the fire, and the gold boiled up and poured out over the whole of the hut, until every part of it, both inside and out, was gilded. But when the gold began to bubble up, the old hag grew so terrified that she fled as if the evil one himself were pursuing her. And she did not remember to stoop down as she went through the doorway, and so she split her head and died. Next morning the sheriff came travelling by there. He was greatly astonished when he saw the gold hut shining and glittering there in the copse, and he was still more astonished when he went in and caught sight of the beautiful young maiden who was sitting there. He fell in love with her at once, and straightway on the spot he begged her, both prettily and kindly, to marry him. "Well, but have you a great deal of money?" said the Master-Maid. "Oh, yes, so far as that is concerned, I am not ill off," said the sheriff. So now he had to go home to get the money, and in the evening he came back, bringing with him a bag with 2 bushels in it, which he set down on the bench. Well, as he had such a fine lot of money, the Master-Maid said she would have him, so they sat down to talk. But scarcely had they sat down together before the Master-Maid wanted to jump up again. "I have forgotten to see to the fire," she said. "Why should you jump up to do that?" said the sheriff. "I will do that." So he jumped up and went to the chimney in one bound. "Just tell me when you have got hold of the shovel," said the Master-Maid. "Well, I have hold of it now," said the sheriff. "Then you may hold the shovel, and the shovel you, and pour red-hot coals over you till day dawns," said the Master-Maid. So the sheriff had to stand there the whole night and pour red-hot coals over himself, and no matter how much he cried and begged and entreated, the red-hot coals did not grow the colder for that. When the day began to dawn, and he had power to throw down the shovel, he did not stay long where he was, but ran away as fast as he possibly could, and everyone who met him stared and looked after him, for he was flying as if he were mad, and he could not have looked worse if he had been both flayed and tanned. And everyone wondered where he had been, but for very shame he would tell nothing. The next day the attorney came riding by the place where the Master-Maid dwelt. He saw how brightly the hut shone and gleamed through the wood, and he too went into it to see who lived there. And when he entered and saw the beautiful young maiden, he fell even more in love with her than the sheriff had done, and began to woo her at once. So the Master-Maid asked him, as she had asked the sheriff, if he had a great deal of money. And the attorney said he was not ill off for that, and would at once go home to get it. And at night he came with a great big sack of money. This time it was a 4-bushel sack, and set it on the bench by the Master-Maid. So she promised to have him, and he sat down on the bench by her to arrange about it, but suddenly she said that she had forgotten to lock the door of the porch that night, and must do it. "Why should you do that?" said the attorney. "Sit still, I will do it." So he was on his feet in a moment and out in the porch. "Tell me when you have got hold of the door latch," said the Master-Maid. "I have hold of it now," cried the attorney. "Then you may hold the door, and the door you, and may you go between wall and wall till day dawns." What a dance the attorney had that night! He had never had such a waltz before, and he never wished to have such a dance again. Sometimes he was in front of the door, and sometimes the door was in front of him, and it went from one side of the porch to the other, till the attorney was well nigh beaten to death. At first he began to abuse the Master-Maid, and then to beg and pray. But the door did not care for anything but keeping him where he was till break of day. As soon as the door let go its hold of him, off went the attorney. He forgot who ought to be paid off for what he had suffered. He forgot both his sack of money and his wooing, for he was so afraid lest the house door should come dancing after him. Everyone who met him stared and looked after him, for he was flying like a madman, and he could not have looked worse if a herd of rams had been butting at him all night long. On the 3rd day the bailiff came by, and he too saw the gold house in the little wood, and he too felt that he must go and see who lived there. And when he caught sight of the Master-Maid, he became so much in love with her that he wooed her almost before he greeted her. The Master-Maid answered him, as she had answered the other two, that if he had a great deal of money, she would have him. "So far as that is concerned, I am not ill off," said the bailiff, so he was at once told to go home and fetch it, and this he did. At night he came back, and he had a still larger sack of money with him than the attorney had brought. It must have been at least 6 bushels, and he set it down on the bench. So it was settled that he was to have the Master-Maid. But hardly had they sat down together before she said that she had forgotten to bring in the calf, and must go out to put it in the byre. "No, indeed, you shall not do that," said the bailiff. "I am the one to do that." And, big and fat as he was, he went out as briskly as a boy. "Tell me when you have got hold of the calf's tail," said the Master-Maid. "I have hold of it now," cried the bailiff. "Then may you hold the calf's tail, and the calf's tail hold you, and may you go round the world together till day dawns," said the Master-Maid. So the bailiff had to bestir himself, for the calf went over rough and smooth, over hill and dale, and the more the bailiff cried and screamed, the faster the calf went. When daylight began to appear, the bailiff was half dead, and so glad was he to leave loose of the calf's tail that he forgot the sack of money and all else. He walked now slowly, more slowly than the sheriff and the attorney had done, but the slower he went, the more time had everyone to stare and look at him, and they used it too, and no one can imagine how tired out and ragged he looked after his dance with the calf. On the following day the wedding was to take place in the king's palace, and the elder brother was to drive to church with his bride, and the brother, who had been with the giant, with her sister. But when they had seated themselves in the coach and were about to drive off from the palace, one of the trace pins broke, and, though they made 1, 2, and 3 to put in its place, that did not help them, for each broke in turn, no matter what kind of wood they used to make them of. This went on for a long time, and they could not get away from the palace, so they were all in great trouble. Then the sheriff said, for he too had been bidden to the wedding at court, "Yonder away in the thicket dwells a maiden, and if you can get her to lend you the handle of the shovel that she uses to make up her fire, I know very well that it will hold fast." So they sent off a messenger to the thicket, and begged so prettily that they might have the loan of her shovel handle of which the sheriff had spoken, that they were not refused. So now they had a trace pin which would not snap in two. But all at once, just as they were starting, the bottom of the coach fell in pieces. They made a new bottom as fast as they could, but no matter how they nailed it together, or what kind of wood they used, no sooner had they got the new bottom into the coach, and were about to drive off, than it broke again, so that they were still worse off than when they had broken the trace pin. Then the attorney said, for he too was at the wedding in the palace, "Away there, in the thicket dwells a maiden, and if you could but get her to lend you one half of her porch door, I am certain that it will hold together." So they again sent a messenger to the thicket, and begged so prettily for the loan of the gilded porch door of which the attorney had told them that they got it at once. They were just setting out again, but now the horses were not able to draw the coach. They had 6 horses already, and now they put in 8, and then 10, and then 12. But the more they put in, and the more the coachman whipped them, the less good it did, and the coach never stirred from the spot. It was already beginning to be late in the day, and to church they must and would go, so everyone who was in the palace was in a state of distress. Then the bailiff spoke up and said, "Out there in the gilded cottage in the thicket dwells a girl, and if you could but get her to lend you her calf, I know it could draw the coach, even if it were as heavy as a mountain." They all thought that it was ridiculous to be drawn to church by a calf, but there was nothing else for it but to send a messenger once more, and beg as prettily as they could, on behalf of the king, that she would let them have the loan of the calf that the bailiff had told them about. The Master-Maid let them have it immediately. This time also she would not say no. Then they harnessed the calf to see if the coach would move, and away it went, over rough and smooth, over stock and stone, so that they could scarcely breathe, and sometimes they were on the ground, and sometimes up in the air. And when they came to the church, the coach began to go round and round like a spinning wheel, and it was with the utmost difficulty and danger that they were able to get out of the coach and into the church. And when they went back again, the coach went quicker still, so that most of them did not know how they got back to the palace at all. When they had seated themselves at the table, the prince who had been in service with the giant said that he thought they ought to have invited the maiden who had lent them the shovel handle and the porch door and the calf up to the palace. "For," said he, "if we had not got these 3 things, we should never have got away from the palace." The king also thought that this was both just and proper, so he sent 5 of his best men down to the gilded hut to greet the maiden courteously from the king, and to beg her to be so good as to come up to the palace to dinner at midday. "Greet the king and tell him that, if he is too good to come to me, I am too good to come to him," replied the Master-Maid. So the king had to go himself, and the Master-Maid went with him immediately, and, as the king believed that she was more than she appeared to be, he seated her in the place of honor by the youngest bridegroom. When they had sat at the table for a short time, the Master-Maid took out the cock, and the hen, and the golden apple which she had brought away with her from the giant's house, and set them on the table in front of her, and instantly the cock and the hen began to fight with each other for the golden apple. "Oh, look how those 2 there are fighting for the golden apple," said the king's son. "Yes, and so did we 2 fight to get out that time when we were in the mountain," said the Master-Maid. So the prince knew her again, and you may imagine how delighted he was. He ordered the troll witch who had rolled the apple to him to be torn in pieces between 4 and 20 horses, so that not a bit of her was left, And then for the first time they began really to keep the wedding, and, weary as they were, the sheriff, the attorney, and the bailiff kept it up too. The Prince Hyacinth and the dear little princess. Once upon a time there lived a king who was deeply in love with a princess, but she could not marry anyone because she was under an enchantment. So the king set out to seek a fairy and asked what he could do to win the princess's love. The fairy said to him, "You know that the princess has a great cat which she is very fond of. Whoever is clever enough to tread on that cat's tail is the man she is destined to marry." The king said to himself that this would not be very difficult, and he left the fairy, determined to grind the cat's tail to powder rather than not tread on it at all. You may imagine that it was not long before he went to see the princess, and Puss, as usual, marched in before him, arching his back. The king took a long step, and quite thought he had the tail under his foot, but the cat turned round so sharply that he only trod on air. And so it went on for 8 days, till the king began to think that this fatal tail must be full of quicksilver. It was never still for a moment. At last, however, he was lucky enough to come upon Puss fast asleep and with his tail conveniently spread out. So the king, without losing a moment, set his foot upon it heavily. With one terrific yell, the cat sprang up and instantly changed into a tall man, who, fixing his angry eyes upon the king, said, "You shall marry the princess because you have been able to break the enchantment, but I will have my revenge. You shall have a son who will never be happy until he finds out that his nose is too long, and if you ever tell anyone what I have just said to you, you shall vanish away instantly, and no one shall ever see you or hear of you again." Though the king was horribly afraid of the enchanter, he could not help laughing at this threat. "If my son has such a long nose as that," he said to himself, "he must always see it, or feel it at least, if he is not blind or without hands." But as the enchanter had vanished, he did not waste any more time in thinking, but went to seek the princess, who very soon consented to marry him. But after all, they had not been married very long when the king died, and the queen had nothing left to care for but her little son, who was called Hyacinth. The little prince had large blue eyes, the prettiest eyes in the world, and a sweet little mouth. But alas! His nose was so enormous that it covered half his face. The queen was inconsolable when she saw this great nose, but her ladies assured her that it was not really as large as it looked, that it was a Roman nose, and you had only to open any history to see that every hero has a large nose. The queen, who was devoted to her baby, was pleased with what they told her, and when she looked at Hyacinth again, his nose certainly did not seem to her quite so large. The prince was brought up with great care, and, as soon as he could speak, they told him all sorts of dreadful stories about people who had short noses. No one was allowed to come near him whose nose did not more or less resemble his own, and the courtiers, to get into favour with the queen, took to pulling their babies' noses several times every day to make them grow long. But, do what they would, they were nothing by comparison with the prince's. When he grew sensible, he learned history, and whenever any great prince or beautiful princess was spoken of, his teachers took care to tell him that they had long noses. His room was hung with pictures, all of people with very large noses, and the prince grew up so convinced that a long nose was a great beauty, that he would not on any account have had his own a single inch shorter. When his 20th birthday was past, the queen thought it was time that he should be married. So she commanded that the portraits of several princesses should be brought for him to see. and among the others was a picture of the dear little princess. Now, she was the daughter of a great king, and would some day possess several kingdoms herself. But Prince Hyacinth had not a thought to spare for anything of that sort. He was so much struck with her beauty. The princess, whom he thought quite charming, had, however, a little saucy nose, which, in her face, was the prettiest thing possible. But it was a cause of great embarrassment to the courtiers, who had got into such a habit of laughing at little noses that they sometimes found themselves laughing at hers before they had time to think. But this did not do at all before the prince, who quite failed to see the joke, and actually banished 2 of his courtiers who had dared to mention disrespectfully the dear little princess's tiny nose. The others, taking warning from this, learned to think twice before they spoke, and one even went so far as to tell the prince that, though it was quite true that no man could be worth anything unless he had a long nose, still, a woman's beauty was a different thing, and he knew a learned man who understood Greek and had read in some old manuscripts that the beautiful Cleopatra herself had a tip-toed nose. The prince made him a splendid present as a reward for this good news, and at once sent ambassadors to ask the dear little princess in marriage. The king, her father, gave his consent, and Prince Hyacinth, who, in his anxiety to see the princess, had gone 3 leagues to meet her, was just advancing to kiss her hand when, to the horror of all who stood by, the enchanter appeared as suddenly as a flash of lightning, and, snatching up the dear little princess, whirled her away out of their sight. The prince was left quite unconsolable, and declared that nothing should induce him to go back to his kingdom until he had found her again, and refusing to allow any of his courtiers to follow him, he mounted his horse and rode sadly away, letting the animal choose his own path. So it happened that he came presently to a great plain, across which he rode all day long without seeing a single house, and horse and rider were terribly hungry, when, as the night fell, the prince caught sight of a light which seemed to shine from a cavern. He rode up to it and saw a little old woman who appeared to be at least 100 years old. She put on her spectacles to look at Prince Hyacinth, but it was quite a long time before she could fix them securely, because her nose was so very short. The prince and the fairy, for that was who she was, had no sooner looked at one another than they went into fits of laughter and cried at the same moment, "Oh, what a funny nose!" "Not so funny as your own," said Prince Hyacinth to the fairy, "but, madam, I beg you to leave the consideration of our noses, such as they are, and to be good enough to give me something to eat, for I am starving, and so is my poor horse." "With all my heart," said the fairy. "Though your nose is so ridiculous, you are nevertheless the son of my best friend. I loved your father as if he had been my brother. Now he had a very handsome nose." "And pray, what does mine lack?" said the prince. "Oh, it doesn't lack anything," replied the fairy. "On the contrary, quite, there is only too much of it. But never mind, one may be a very worthy man, though his nose is too long. I was telling you that I was your father's friend. He often came to see me in the old times, and you must know that I was very pretty in those days. At least, he used to say so. I should like to tell you of a conversation we had the last time I ever saw him." "Indeed," said the prince. "When I have supped, it will give me the greatest pleasure to hear it. But consider, madam, I beg of you, that I have had nothing to eat today." "The poor boy is right," said the fairy. "I was forgetting. Come in then, and I will give you some supper. And while you are eating, I can tell you my story in a very few words. For I don't like endless tales myself. Too long a tongue is worse than too long a nose, and I remember when I was young that I was so much admired for not being a great chatterer. They used to tell the queen, my mother, that it was so, For though you see what I am now, I was the daughter of a great king. My father, your father, I dare say, got something to eat when he was hungry," interrupted the prince. "Oh, certainly," answered the fairy, "and you also shall have supper directly. I only just wanted to tell you, but I really cannot listen to anything until I have had something to eat," cried the prince, who was getting quite angry. But then, remembering that he had better be polite, as he much needed the fairy's help, he added, "I know that in the pleasure of listening to you I should quite forget my own hunger, but my horse, who cannot hear you, must really be fed." The fairy was very much flattered by this compliment, and said, calling to her servants, "You shall not wait another minute. You are so polite, and in spite of the enormous size of your nose, you are really very agreeable. Plague, take the old lady, how she does go on about my nose," said the prince to himself. "One would almost think that mine had taken all the extra length that hers lacks. If I were not so hungry, I would soon have done with this chatterpie who thinks she talks very little. How stupid people are not to see their own faults. That comes of being a princess. She has been spoiled by flatterers who have made her believe that she is quite a moderate talker." Meanwhile, the servants were putting the supper on the table, and the prince was much amused to hear the fairy, who asked them 1,000 questions simply for the pleasure of hearing herself speak. Especially, he noticed one maid who, no matter what was being said, always contrived to praise her mistress's wisdom. "Well," he thought as he ate his supper, "I'm very glad I came here. This just shows me how sensible I have been in never listening to flatterers. People of that sort praise us to our faces without shame, and hide our faults or change them into virtues. For my part, I never will be taken in by them. I know my own defects, I hope." Poor Prince Hyacinth! He really believed what he said, and hadn't an idea that the people who had praised his nose were laughing at him, just as the fairy's maid was laughing at her, for the prince had seen her laugh slyly when she could do so without the fairy's noticing her. However, he said nothing, and presently, when his hunger began to be appeased, the fairy said, "My dear prince, might I beg you to move a little more that way? For your nose casts such a shadow that I really cannot see what I have on my plate." "Ah, thanks. Now let us speak of your father. When I went to his court, he was only a little boy, but that is 40 years ago, and I have been in this desolate place ever since. Tell me what goes on nowadays. Are the ladies as fond of amusement as ever? In my time, one saw them at parties, theatres, balls, and promenades every day. Dear me! What a long nose you have! I cannot get used to it." "Really, madam," said the prince, "I wish you would leave off mentioning my nose. It cannot matter to you what it is like. I am quite satisfied with it, and have no wish to have it shorter. One must take what is given. One. "Now you are angry with me, my poor Hyacinth," said the fairy, "and I assure you that I didn't mean to vex you. On the contrary, I wished to do you a service. However, though I really cannot help your nose being a shock to me, I will try not to say anything about it. I will even try to think that you have an ordinary nose. To tell the truth, it would make 3 reasonable ones." The prince, who was no longer hungry, grew so impatient at the fairy's continual remarks about his nose that at last he threw himself upon his horse and rode hastily away. But wherever he came in his journeyings, he thought the people were mad, for they all talked of his nose, and yet he could not bring himself to admit that it was too long. He had been so used all his life to hear it called handsome. The old fairy, who wished to make him happy, at last hit upon a plan. She shut the dear little princess up in a palace of crystal, and put this palace down where the prince would not fail to find it. His joy at seeing the princess again was extreme, and he set to work with all his might to try to break her prison. But in spite of all his efforts, he failed utterly. In despair, he thought at least that he would try to get near enough to speak to the dear little princess, who, on her part, stretched out her hand that he might kiss it, but turn which way he might, he never could raise it to his lips, for his long nose always prevented it. For the first time he realized how long it really was, and exclaimed, "Well, it must be admitted that my nose is too long." In an instant, the crystal prison flew into 1,000 splinters, and the old fairy, taking the dear little princess by the hand, said to the prince, "Now, say if you are not very much obliged to me. Much good it was for me to talk to you about your nose. You would never have found out how extraordinary it was if it hadn't hindered you from doing what you wanted to. You see how self-love keeps us from knowing our own defects of mind and body. Our reason tries in vain to show them to us. We refuse to see them till we find them in the way of our interests. Prince Hyacinth, whose nose was now just like anyone's else, did not fail to profit by the lesson he had received. He married the dear little princess, and they lived happily ever after. The Princess on the Glass Hill. Once upon a time there was a man who had a meadow which lay on the side of a mountain, and in the meadow there was a barn in which he stored hay. But there had not been much hay in the barn for the last 2 years, for every Saint Sain, John's Eve, when the grass was in the height of its vigour, it was all eaten clean up, just as if a whole flock of sheep had gnawed it down to the ground during the night. This happened once, and it happened twice, but then the man got tired of losing his crop and said to his sons, he had 3 of them, and the third was called Cinderlad, that one of them must go and sleep in the barn on St. John's night, for it was absurd to let the grass be eaten up again, blade and stalk, as it had been the last 2 years, and the one who went to watch must keep a sharp lookout, the man said. The eldest was quite willing to go to the meadow. He would watch the grass, he said, and he would do it so well that neither man nor beast, nor even the devil himself should have any of it. So, when evening came, he went to the barn and lay down to sleep. But when night was drawing near, there was such a rumbling and such an earthquake that the walls and roof shook again, and the lad jumped up and took to his heels as fast as he could, and never even looked back. And the barn remained empty that year, just as it had been for the last 2. Next Saint, John's Eve. The man again said that he could not go on in this way, losing all the grass in the outlying field year after year, and that one of his sons must just go there and watch it, and watch well too. So the next oldest son was willing to show what he could do. He went to the barn and lay down to sleep, as his brother had done. But when night was drawing near, there was a great rumbling, and then an earthquake, which was even worse than that on the former St. John's night, and when the youth heard it he was terrified, and went off, running as if for a wager. The year after, it was Cinderlad's turn, but when he made ready to go, the others laughed at him and mocked him. "Well, you are just the right one to watch the hay, you who have never learned anything but how to sit among the ashes and bake yourself," said they. Cinderlad, however, did not trouble himself about what they said, but when evening drew near, rambled away to the outlying field. When he got there, he went into the barn and lay down, but in about an hour's time the rumbling and creaking began, and it was frightful to hear it. "Well, if it gets no worse than that, I can manage to stand it," thought Cinderlad. In a little time the creaking began again, and the earth quaked so that all the hay flew about the boy. "Oh, if it gets no worse than that, I can manage to stand it," thought Cinderlad. But then came a third rumbling and a third earthquake, so violent that the boy thought the walls and roof had fallen down. But when that was over, everything suddenly grew as still as death around him. "I am pretty sure that it will come again," thought Cinderlad, but no, it did not. Everything was quiet, and everything stayed quiet. And when he had lain still a short time, he heard something that sounded as if a horse was standing chewing just outside the barn door. He stole away to the door, which was ajar, to see what was there, and a horse was standing eating. It was so big and fat, and fine a horse that Cinderlad had never seen one like it before, and a saddle and bridle lay upon it, and a complete suit of armour for a knight, and everything was of copper, and so bright that it shone again. "Ha, ha, it is thou who eatest up our hay then," thought the boy, "but I will stop that." So he made haste, and took out his steel for striking fire, and threw it over the horse, and then it had no power to stir from the spot, and became so tame that the boy could do what he liked with it. So he mounted it, and rode away to a place which no one knew of but himself, and there he tied it up. When he went home again, his brothers laughed, and asked how he had got on. "You didn't lie long in the barn, if even you have been so far as the field," said they. "I lay in the barn till the sun rose, but I saw nothing, and heard nothing, not I," said the boy. "God knows what there was to make you two so frightened." "Well, we shall soon see whether you have watched the meadow or not," answered the brothers. But when they got there, the grass was all standing just as long and as thick as it had been the night before. The next Saint, John's Eve, it was the same thing. Once again, neither of the two brothers dared to go to the outlying field to watch the crop, but Cinderlad went, and everything happened exactly the same as on the previous St. John's Eve. First, there was a rumbling and an earthquake, and then there was another, and then a third. But all three earthquakes were much, very much more violent than they had been the year before. Then everything became still as death again, and the boy heard something chewing outside the barn door, so he stole as softly as he could to the door, which was slightly ajar, and again there was a horse standing close by the wall of the house, eating and chewing, and it was far larger and fatter than the first horse, and it had a saddle on its back, and a bridle was on it too, and a full suit of armour for a knight, all of bright silver, and as beautiful as anyone could wish to see. "Ho, ho," thought the boy, "is it thou who eatest up our hay in the night? But I will put a stop to that." So he took out his steel for striking fire, and threw it over the horse's mane, and the beast stood there as quiet as a lamb. Then the boy rode this horse too, away to the place where he kept the other, and then went home again. "I suppose you will tell us that you have watched well again this time," said the brothers. "Well, so I have," said Cinderlad. So they went there again, and there the grass was, standing as high and as thick as it had been before. But that did not make them any kinder to Cinderlad. When the third St. Cinderlad, John's night, came, neither of the two elder brothers dared to lie in the outlying barn to watch the grass, for they had been so heartily frightened the night that they had slept there that they could not get over it. But Cinderlad dared to go, and everything happened just the same as on the two former nights. There were 3 earthquakes, each worse than the other, and the last flung the boy from one wall of the barn to the other. But then everything suddenly became still as death. When he had lain quietly a short time, he heard something chewing outside the barn door. Then he once more stole to the door, which was slightly ajar, and behold, a horse was standing just outside it, which was much larger and fatter than the 2 others he had caught. "Ho, ho! It is thou, then, who art eating up our hay this time," thought the boy. "But I will put a stop to that." So he pulled out his steel for striking fire and threw it over the horse, and it stood as still as if it had been nailed to the field, and the boy could do just what he liked with it. Then he mounted it and rode away to the place where he had the two others, and then he went home again. Then the two brothers mocked him just as they had done before, and told him that they could see that he must have watched the grass very carefully that night, for he looked just as if he were walking in his sleep. But Cinderlad did not trouble himself about that, but just bade them go to the field and see. They did go, and this time, too, the grass was standing, looking as fine and as thick as ever. The king of the country in which Cinderlad's father dwelt had a daughter whom he would give to no one who could not ride up to the top of the glass hill, for there was a high, high hill of glass, slippery as ice, and it was close to the king's palace. Upon the very top of this the king's daughter was to sit with 3 gold apples in her lap, and the man who could ride up and take the 3 golden apples should marry her and have half the kingdom. The king had this proclaimed in every church in the whole kingdom, and in many other kingdoms too. The princess was very beautiful, and all who saw her fell violently in love with her, even in spite of themselves. So it is needless to say that all the princes and knights were eager to win her, and half the kingdom besides, and that for this cause they came riding thither from the very end of the world, dressed so splendidly that their raiments gleamed in the sunshine, and riding on horses which seemed to dance as they went, and there was not one of these princes who did not think that he was sure to win the princess. When the day appointed by the king had come, there was such a host of knights and princes under the glass hill that they seemed to swarm, and everyone who could walk or even creep was there too, to see who won the king's daughter. Cinderlad's 2 brothers were there too, but they would not hear of letting him go with them, for he was so dirty and black with sleeping and grubbing among the ashes that they said everyone would laugh at them if they were seen in the company of such an oaf. "Well then, I will go all alone by myself," said Cinderlad. When the 2 brothers got to the glass hill, all the princes and knights were trying to ride up it, and their horses were in a foam, but it was all in vain, for no sooner did the horses set foot upon the hill than down they slipped, and there was not one which could get even so much as a couple of yards up. Nor was that strange, for the hill was as smooth as a glass window-pane, and as steep as the side of a house. But they were all eager to win the king's daughter and half the kingdom, so they rode and they slipped, and thus it went on. At length all the horses were so tired that they could do no more, and so hot that the foam dropped from them, and the riders were forced to give up the attempt. The king was just thinking that he would cause it to be proclaimed that the riding should begin afresh on the following day, when perhaps it might go better, when suddenly a knight came riding up on so fine a horse that no one had ever seen the like of it before. And the knight had armour of copper, and his bridle was of copper too, and all his accoutrements were so bright that they shone again. The other knights all called out to him that he might just as well spare himself the trouble of trying to ride up the glass hill, for it was of no use to try, but he did not heed them, and rode straight off to it, and went up as if it were nothing at all. Thus he rode for a long way. It may have been a third part of the way up, but when he had got so far he turned his horse round and rode down again. But the princess thought that she had never yet seen so handsome a knight, and while he was riding up she was sitting thinking, "Oh, how I hope he may be able to come up to the top." And when she saw that he was turning his horse back, she threw one of the golden apples down after him, and it rolled into his shoe. But when he had come down from off the hill, he rode away, and that so fast that no one knew what had become of him. So all the princes and knights were bidden to present themselves before the king that night, so that he who had ridden so far up the glass hill might show the golden apple which the king's daughter had thrown down. but no one had anything to show. One knight presented himself after the other, and none could show the apple. At night, too, Cinderlad's brothers came home again and had a long story to tell about riding up the glass hill. At first they said there was not one who was able to get even so much as one step up. But then came a knight who had armor of copper and a bridle of copper, and his armor and trappings were so bright that they shone to a great distance, and it was something like a sight to see him riding. He rode 1/3 of the way up the glass hill, and he could easily have ridden the whole of it if he had liked. But he had turned back, for he had made up his mind that that was enough for once. "Oh, I should have liked to see him too, that I should," said Cinderlad, who was as usual sitting by the chimney among the cinders. "You indeed," said the brothers. "You look as if you were fit to be among such great lords. Nasty beast that you are to sit there." Next day the brothers were for setting out again, and this time too Cinderlad begged them to let him go with them and see who rode. But no, they said he was not fit to do that, for he was much too ugly and dirty. "Well, well, then, I will go all alone by myself," said Cinderlad. So the brothers went to the glass hill, and all the princes and knights began to ride again, and this time they had taken care to roughen the shoes of their horses. But that did not help them. They rode and they slipped as they had done the day before, and not one of them could get even so far as a yard up the hill. When they had tired out their horses, so that they could do no more, they again had to stop altogether. But just as the king was thinking that it would be well to proclaim that the riding should take place next day for the last time, so that they might have one more chance, he suddenly bethought himself that it would be well to wait a little longer to see if the knight in copper armor would come on this day too. But nothing was to be seen of him. Just as they were still looking for him, however, came a knight riding on a steed that was much, much finer than that which the knight in copper armor had ridden. And this knight had silver armor and a silver saddle and bridle, and all were so bright that they shone and glistened when he was a long way off. Again the other knights called to him, and said that he might just as well give up the attempt to ride up the glass hill, for it was useless to try. But the knight paid no heed to that, but rode straight away to the glass hill, and went still farther up than the knight in copper armor had gone. But when he had ridden 2/3 of the way up, he turned his horse around and rode down again. The princess liked this knight still better than she had liked the other, and sat longing that he might be able to get up above. And when she saw him turning back, she threw the second apple after him, and it rolled into his shoe. And as soon as he had got down the glass hill, he rode away so fast that no one could see what had become of him. In the evening, when everyone was to appear before the king and princess, in order that he who had the golden apple might show it, one knight went in after the other, but none of them had a golden apple to show. At night the two brothers went home as they had done the night before, and told how things had gone, and how everyone had ridden, but no one had been able to get up the hill. But last of all, they said, came one in silver armor, and he had a silver bridle on his horse, and a silver saddle, and oh, but he could ride! He took his horse 2/3 of the way up the hill, but then he turned back. He was a fine fellow, said the brothers, and the princess threw the second golden apple to him. Oh, how I should have liked to see him too, said Cinderlad. Oh, indeed, he was a little brighter than the ashes that you sit grubbing among, you dirty black creature, said the brothers. On the third day, everything went just as on the former days. Cinderlad wanted to go with them to look at the riding, but the two brothers would not have him in their company, and when they got to the glass hill, there was no one who could ride even so far as a yard up it, and everyone waited for the knight in silver armor, but he was neither to be seen nor heard of. At last, after a long time, came a knight riding upon a horse that was such a fine one, its equal had never yet been seen. The knight had golden armour, and the horse a golden saddle and bridle, and these were all so bright that they shone and dazzled everyone, even while the knight was still at a great distance. The other princes and knights were not able even to call to tell him how useless it was to try to ascend the hill. So amazed were they at sight of his magnificence. He rode straight away to the glass hill and galloped up it as if it were no hill at all, so that the princess had not even time to wish that he might get up the whole way. As soon as he had ridden to the top, he took the third golden apple from the lap of the princess, and then turned his horse about and rode down again, and vanished from their sight before anyone was able to say a word to him. When the two brothers came home again at night, they had much to tell of how the riding had gone off that day, and at last they told about the knight in the golden armour too. He was a fine fellow, that was. Such another splendid knight is not to be found on earth, said the brothers. Oh, how I should have liked to see him too, said Cinderlad. Well, he shone nearly as brightly as the coal-heaps that thou art always lying raking among. Dirty black creature that thou art, said the brothers. Next day all the knights and princes were to appear before the king and princess. It had been too late for them to do it the night before, in order that he who had the golden apple might produce it. They all went in turn, first princes and then knights, but none of them had a golden apple. But somebody must have it, said the king, for with our own eyes we all saw a man ride up and take it. So he commanded that everyone in the kingdom should come to the palace and see if he could show the apple. And one after the other they all came, but no one had the golden apple, and after a long time Cinderlad's two brothers came likewise. They were the last of all, so the king inquired of them if there was no one else in the kingdom left to come. Oh, yes, we have a brother, said the two, but he never got the golden apple. He never left the cinder heap on any of the 3 days. Never mind that, said the king. As everyone else has come to the palace, let him come too. So Cinderlad was forced to go to the king's palace. Hast thou the golden apple? Asked the king. Yes.
Here is the first, and here is the second, and here is the third too,
said Cinderlad. And he took all 3 apples out of his pocket, and with that drew off his sooty rags, and appeared there before them in his bright golden armour, which gleamed as he stood. Thou shalt have my daughter, and the half of my kingdom, and thou hast well earned both, said the king. So there was a wedding, and Cinderlad got the king's daughter, and everyone made merry at the wedding, for all of them could make merry, though they could not ride up the glass hill, and if they have not left off their merry-making, they must be at it still. The Red Etin, there were aunts 2, widows that lived on a small bit of ground which they rented from a farmer. Ane of them had 2 sons, and the other had ane, and by it was time for the wife that had 2 sons to send them away to seek their fortune. So she told her eldest son a day to take a can and bring her water from the well, that she might bake a cake for him, and however much or however little water he might bring, the cake would be great, or sma's, accordingly, and that cake was to be that she could gie him when he went on his travels. The lad gaed away with the can to the well, and filled it with water, and then came away hame again. But the can being broken, the maist part of the water had run out before he got back. So his cake was very sma', yet sma's as it was, his mother asked if he was willing to take the half of it with her blessing, telling him that, if he chose rather to have the hale, he would only get it would her curse. The young man, thinking he might have to travel a far way, and not knowing when or how he might get other provisions, said he would like to hae the hale cake come of his mother's malison. What like? So she gave him the hale cake, and her malison a lang wit. Then he took his brither aside, and gave him a knife to keep till he should come back, desiring him to look at it every morning, and as lang as it continued to be clear, then he might be sure that the owner of it was well. But if it grew dim and rusty, then for certain some ill had befallen him. So the young man set out to seek his fortune. And he gaed that day, and the next day, and on the third day, in the afternoon, he came up to where a shepherd was sitting with a flock of sheep. And he gaed up to the shepherd, and asked him wha the sheep belanged to. And the man answered, the Red Etin of Ireland. Ance lived in Belligan, and stole King Malcolm's daughter, the king of fair Scotland. He beats her, he binds her, he lays her on a band, and every day he dings her with a bright silver wand. Like Julian the Roman, he's one that fears no man. It's said there's an predestinate to be his mortal foe, but that man is yet unborn, and lang may it be so. The young man then went on his journey, and he had not gone far when he espied an old man with white locks herding a flock of swine. And he gaed up to him and asked whose swine these were, when the man answered, the Red Etin of Ireland. Then the young man gaed on a bit farther, and came to another very old man herding goats, and when he asked whose goats they were, the answer was, the Red Etin of Ireland. This old man also told him to beware of the next beasts that he should meet, for they were of a very different kind from any he had yet seen. So the young man went on, and by he saw a multitude of very dreadful beasts, ilk ane of them with 2 heads, and on every head 4 horns. And he was sore frightened, and ran away from them as fast as he could. And glad was he when he came to a castle that stood on a hillock, with the door standing wide to the wa. And he gaed into the castle for shelter, and there he saw an old wife sitting beside the kitchen fire. He asked the wife if he might stay there for the night, as he was tired, was a lang journey. And the wife said he might. But it was not a good place for him to be in, as it belonged to the Red Etin, who was a very terrible beast, by 3 heads, that spared no living man he could get hold of. The young man would have gone away, but he was afraid of the beasts on the outside of the castle, so he beseeched the old woman to conceal him as well as she could, and not to tell the Etin that he was there. He thought if he could put over the night, he might get away in the morning without meeting with the beasts, and so escape. But he had not been long in his hidey-hole before the awful Etin came in, and nae sooner was he in than he was heard crying, Snook but, and Snook ben, I find the smell of an earthly man, be he living, or be he dead. His heart this night shall kitchen my bread. The monster soon found the poor young man, and pulled him from his hole, and when he had got him out, he told him that if he could answer him 3 questions, his life should be spared. The first was, whether Ireland or Scotland was first inhabited. The second was, whether man was made for woman, or woman for man. The third was, whether men or brutes were made first. The lad not being able to answer one of these questions, the Red Etin took a mace and knocked him on the head, and turned him into a pillar of stone. On the morning after this happened, the younger brother took out the knife to look at it, and he was grieved to find it a brown with rust. He told his mother that the time was now come for him to go away upon his travels also, so she requested him to take the can to the well for water, that she might bake a cake for him. The can being broken, He brought hame as little water as the other had done, and the cake was as little. She asked whether he would have the hale cake was her malison, or the half was her blessing, and, like his brother, he thought it best to have the hale cake, come o, the malison, what might. So he gaed away, and everything happened to him that had happened to his brother. The other widow and her son heard of her, that had happened frae a fairy, and the young man determined that he would also go upon his travels, and see if he could do anything to relieve his twa friends. So his mother gave him a can to go to the well and bring home water, that she might bake him a cake for his journey. And he gaed, and as he was bringing hame the water, a raven abune his head cried to him to look, and he would see that the water was running out. And he was a young man of sense, and seeing the water running out, he took some clay and patched up the holes, so that he brought home enough water to bake a large cake. When his mother put it to him to take the half cake was her blessing, he took it in preference to having the hale was her malison, and yet the half was bigger than what the other lads had got of each other. So he gaed away on his journey, and after he had travelled a far way, he met with an old woman that asked him if he would give her a bit of his bannock. And he said he would gladly do that, and so he gave her a piece of the bannock, and for that she gied him a magical wand, that she said might yet be of service to him if he took care to use it rightly. Then the old woman, who was a fairy, told him a great deal that would happen to him, and what he ought to do in the circumstances, and after that she vanished in an instant out of his sight. He gaed on a great way farther, and then he came up to the old man herding the sheep, and when he asked whose sheep these were, the answer was, the Red Etin of Ireland. Ants lived in Bellicon, and stole King Malcolm's daughter, the King of fair Scotland. He beats her, he binds her, he lays her on a band, and every day he dings her with a bright silver wand. Like Julian the Roman, he's one that fears no man. But now I fear his end is near, and destiny at hand, and you're to be, I plainly see, the heir of all his land. Repeat the same inquiries to the man attending the swine, and the man attending the goats, with the same answer in each case. When he came to the place where the monstrous beasts were standing, he did not stop, nor run away, but went boldly through among them. One came up roaring with open mouth to devour him, when he struck it with his wand, and laid it in an instant dead at his feet. He soon came to the Etin's castle, where he knocked and was admitted. The old woman that sat by the fire warned him of the terrible Etin, and what had been the fate of the two brothers, but he was not to be daunted. The monster soon came in, saying, "Snook, but, and snook, Ben. I find the smell of an earthly man. Be he living, or be he dead, his heart shall be kitchen to my bread." He quickly espied the young man, and bade him come forth on the floor. And then he put the 3 questions to him, but the young man had been told everything by the good fairy, so he was able to answer all the questions. When the Etin found this, he knew that his power was gone. The young man then took up the axe and hewed off the monster's 3 heads. He next asked the old woman to show him where the king's daughters lay, and the old woman took him upstairs and opened a great many doors, and out of every door came a beautiful lady who had been imprisoned there by the Etin, and ane of the ladies was the king's daughter. She also took him down into a low room, and there stood 2 stone pillars that he had only to touch with his wand when his 2 friends and neighbours started into life. And the hale of the prisoners were overjoyed at their deliverance, which they all acknowledged to be owing to the prudent young man. Next day they set out for the king's court, and a gallant company they made. And the king married his daughter to the young man that had delivered her, and gave a noble's daughter to ilk ane of the other young men, and so they lived happily the rest of their days. the Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. There were formerly a king and a queen who were so sorry that they had no children, so sorry that it cannot be expressed. They went to all the waters in the world. Vows, pilgrimages, all ways were tried, and all to no purpose. At last, however, the queen had a daughter. There was a very fine christening, and the princess had for her godmothers all the fairies they could find in the whole kingdom. They found 7, that every one of them might give her a gift, as was the custom of fairies in those days. By this means the princess had all the perfections imaginable. After the ceremonies of the christening were over, all the company returned to the king's palace, where was prepared a great feast for the fairies. There was placed before every one of them a magnificent cover with a case of massive gold, wherein were a spoon, knife, and fork, all of pure gold set with diamonds and rubies. But as they were all sitting down at table, they saw come into the hall a very old fairy, whom they had not invited, because it was above 50 years since she had been out of a certain tower, and she was believed to be either dead or enchanted. The king ordered her a cover, but could not furnish her with a case of gold as the others, because they had only 7 made for the 7 fairies. The old fairy fancied she was slighted, and muttered some threats between her teeth. One of the young fairies who sat by her overheard how she grumbled, and, judging that she might give the little princess some unlucky gift, went, as soon as they rose from table, and hid herself behind the hangings, that she might speak last, and repair, as much as she could, the evil which the old fairy might intend. In the meanwhile, all the fairies began to give their gifts to the princess. The youngest gave her for gift that she should be the most beautiful person in the world. The next, that she should have the wit of an angel. The third, that she should have a wonderful grace in everything she did. The fourth, that she should dance perfectly well. The fifth, that she should sing like a nightingale. And the sixth, that she should play all kinds of music to the utmost perfection. The old fairy's turn coming next, with a head shaking more with spite than age, she said that the princess should have her hand pierced with a spindle and die of the wound. This terrible gift made the whole company tremble, and everybody fell a-crying. At this very instant the young fairy came out from behind the hangings, and spake these words aloud. "Assure yourselves, O king and queen, that your daughter shall not die of this disaster. It is true, I have no power to undo entirely what my elder has done. The princess shall indeed pierce her hand with a spindle. But instead of dying, she shall only fall into a profound sleep, which shall last 100 years, at the expiration of which a king's son shall come and awake her." The king, to avoid the misfortune foretold by the old fairy, caused immediately proclamation to be made, whereby everybody was forbidden, on pain of death, to spin with a distaff and spindle, or to have so much as any spindle in their houses. About 15 or 16 years after, the king and queen being gone to one of their houses of pleasure, the young princess happened one day to divert herself in running up and down the palace. When going up from one apartment to another, she came into a little room on the top of the tower, where a good old woman alone was spinning with her spindle. This good woman had never heard of the king's proclamation against spindles. "What are you doing there, goody?" said the princess. "I am spinning, my pretty child," said the old woman, who did not know who she was. "Ha!" said the princess, "this is very pretty. How do you do it?" "Give it to me, that I may see if I can do so." She had no sooner taken it into her hand than, whether being very hasty at it, somewhat unhandy, or that the decree of the fairy had so ordained it, it ran into her hand, and she fell down in a swoon. The good old woman, not knowing very well what to do in this affair, cried out for help. People came in from every quarter in great numbers. They threw water upon the princess's face, unlaced her, struck her on the palms of her hands, and rubbed her temples with Hungary, water. But nothing would bring her to herself. And now the king, who came up at the noise, bethought himself of the prediction of the fairies, and, judging very well that this must necessarily come to pass, since the fairies had said it, caused the princess to be carried into the finest apartment in his palace, and to be laid upon a bed all embroidered with gold and silver. One would have taken her for a little angel. She was so very beautiful, for her swooning away had not diminished one bit of her complexion. Her cheeks were carnation, and her lips were coral. Indeed, her eyes were shut, but she was heard to breathe softly, which satisfied those about her that she was not dead. The king commanded that they should not disturb her, but let her sleep quietly till her hour of awaking was come. The good fairy who had saved her life by condemning her to sleep 100 years was in the kingdom of Matakin, 12,000 leagues off, when this accident befell the princess. But she was instantly informed of it by a little dwarf, who had boots of 7 leagues, that is, boots with which he could tread over 7 leagues of ground in one stride. The fairy came away immediately, and she arrived, about an hour after, in a fiery chariot drawn by dragons. The king handed her out of the chariot, and she approved everything he had done. But as she had very great foresight, she thought, when the princess should awake, she might not know what to do with herself, being all alone in this old palace. And this was what she did. She touched with her wand everything in the palace except the king and queen. Governesses, maids of honor, ladies of the bedchamber, gentlemen, officers, stewards, cooks, undercooks, scullions, guards with their beefeaters, pages, footmen. She likewise touched all the horses which were in the stables, pads as well as others, the great dogs in the outward court, and pretty little Mopsy too, the princess's little spaniel, which lay by her on the bed. Immediately upon her touching them, they all fell asleep, that they might not awake before their mistress, and that they might be ready to wait upon her when she wanted them. The very spits at the fire, as full as they could hold of partridges and pheasants, did fall asleep also. All this was done in a moment. Fairies are not long in doing their business, and now the king and the queen, having kissed their dear child without waking her, went out of the palace and put forth a proclamation that nobody should dare to come near it. This, however, was not necessary, for in a quarter of an hour's time there grew up all round about the park such a vast number of trees, great and small, bushes and brambles, twining one within another, that neither man nor beast could pass through, so that nothing could be seen but the very top of the towers of the palace, and that too, not unless it was a good way off. Nobody doubted but the fairy gave herein a very extraordinary sample of her art, that the princess, while she continued sleeping, might have nothing to fear from any curious people. When 100 years were gone and past, the son of the king, then reigning, and who was of another family from that of the sleeping princess, being gone a-hunting on that side of the country, asked what those towers were which he saw in the middle of a great thick wood. Everyone answered according as they had heard. Some said that it was a ruinous old castle, haunted by spirits. Others, that all the sorcerers and witches of the country kept there their Sabbath or night's meeting. The common opinion was that an ogre lived there, and that he carried thither all the little children he could catch, that he might eat them up at his leisure, without anybody being able to follow him, as having himself only the power to pass through the wood. The prince was at a stand, not knowing what to believe, when a very good countryman spake to him thus: "May it please your royal highness, it is now about 50 years since I heard from my father, who heard my grandfather say that there was then in this castle a princess, the most beautiful was ever seen, that she must sleep there 100 years, and should be waked by a king's son, for whom she was reserved. The young prince was all on fire at these words, believing, without weighing the matter, that he could put an end to this rare adventure, and, pushed on by love and honour, resolved that moment to look into it. Scarce had he advanced toward the wood when all the great trees, the bushes, and brambles gave way of themselves to let him pass through. He walked up to the castle, which he saw at the end of a large avenue, which he went into. And what a little surprised him was that he saw none of his people could follow him, because the trees closed again as soon as he had passed through them. However, he did not cease from continuing his way. A young and amorous prince is always valiant. He came into a spacious outward court, where everything he saw might have frozen the most fearless person with horror. There reigned all over a most frightful silence. The image of death everywhere showed itself, and there was nothing to be seen but stretched out bodies of men and animals, all seeming to be dead. He, however, very well knew, by the ruby faces and pimpled noses of the beefeaters, that they were only asleep, and their goblets, wherein still remained some drops of wine, showed plainly that they fell asleep in their cups. He then crossed a court paved with marble, went up the stairs, and came into the guard-chamber, where guards were standing in their ranks, with their muskets upon their shoulders, and snoring as loud as they could. After that he went through several rooms full of gentlemen and ladies, all asleep, some standing, others sitting. At last he came into a chamber all gilded with gold, where he saw upon a bed, the curtains of which were all open, the finest sight was ever beheld, a princess, who appeared to be about 15 or 16 years of age, and whose bright and, in a manner, resplendent beauty had somewhat in it divine. He approached with trembling and admiration, and fell down before her upon his knees. And now, as the enchantment was at an end, the princess awaked, and looking on him with eyes more tender than the first view might seem to admit of, "Is it you, my prince?" said she to him. "You have waited a long while." The prince, charmed with these words, and much more with the manner in which they were spoken, knew not how to show his joy and gratitude. He assured her that he loved her better than he did himself. Their discourse was not well connected. They did weep more than talk. Little eloquence, a great deal of love. He was more at a loss than she, and we need not wonder at it. She had time to think on what to say to him, for it is very probable, though history mentions nothing of it, that the good fairy, during so long a sleep, had given her very agreeable dreams. In short, they talked 4 hours together, and yet they said not half what they had to say. In the meanwhile, all the palace awaked. Every one thought upon their particular business, and as all of them were not in love, they were ready to die for hunger. The chief lady of honour, being as sharp-set as other folks, grew very impatient, and told the princess aloud that supper was served up. The prince helped the princess to rise. She was entirely dressed, and very magnificently, but his royal highness took care not to tell her that she was dressed like his great-grandmother, and had a point band peeping over a high collar. She looked not a bit less charming and beautiful for all that. They went into the great hall of looking-glasses, where they supped, and were served by the princess's officers. The violins and hautboys played old tunes, but very excellent, though it was now above 100 years since they had played, and after supper, without losing any time, the Lord Almoner married them in the chapel of the castle, and the chief lady of honour drew the curtains. They had but very little sleep. The princess had no occasion, and the prince left her next morning to return to the city, where his father must needs have been in pain for him. The prince told him that he lost his way in the forest as he was hunting, and that he had lain in the cottage of a charcoal burner, who gave him cheese and brown bread. The king, his father, who was a good man, believed him, but his mother could not be persuaded it was true, and seeing that he went almost every day a-hunting, and that he always had some excuse ready for so doing, though he had lain out 3 or 4 nights together, she began to suspect that he was married, for he lived with the princess above 2 whole years, and had by her 2 children, the eldest of which, who was a daughter, was named Morning, and the youngest, who was a son, they called Day, because he was a great deal handsomer and more beautiful than his sister. The queen spoke several times to her son, to inform herself after what manner he did pass his time, and that in this he ought in duty to satisfy her. But he never dared to trust her with his secret. He feared her, though he loved her, for she was of the race of the ogres, and the king would never have married her had it not been for her vast riches. It was even whispered about the court that she had ogreish inclinations, and that, whenever she saw little children passing by, she had all the difficulty in the world to avoid falling upon them. And so the prince would never tell her one word. But when the king was dead, which happened about 2 years afterward, and he saw himself lord and master, he openly declared his marriage, and he went in great ceremony to conduct his queen to the palace. They made a magnificent entry into the capital city, she riding between her 2 children. Soon after, the king went to make war with the emperor Contalabute, his neighbor. He left the government of the kingdom to the queen his mother, and earnestly recommended to her care his wife and children. He was obliged to continue his expedition all the summer, and as soon as he departed, the queen mother sent her daughter-in-law to a country house among the woods, that she might with the more ease gratify her horrible longing. Some few days afterward she went thither herself, and said to her clerk of the kitchen, "I have a mind to eat little Morning for my dinner to-morrow." "Ah, madam," cried the clerk of the kitchen, "I will have it so," replied the queen. And this she spoke in the tone of an ogress who had a strong desire to eat fresh meat, and will eat her with a sauce. Robert, the poor man, knowing very well that he must not play tricks with ogresses, took his great knife and went up into little Morning's chamber. She was then 4 years old, and came up to him jumping and laughing, to take him about the neck, and ask him for some sugar candy. Upon which he began to weep. The great knife fell out of his hand, and he went into the backyard and killed a little lamb, and dressed it with such good sauce that his mistress assured him that she had never eaten anything so good in her life. He had at the same time taken up little Morning, and carried her to his wife, to conceal her in the lodging he had at the bottom of the courtyard. About 8 days afterward, the wicked queen said to the clerk of the kitchen, "I will sup on little Day." He answered not a word, being resolved to cheat her, as he had done before. He went to find out little Day, and saw him with a little foil in his hand, with which he was fencing with a great monkey, the child being then only 3 years of age. He took him up in his arms and carried him to his wife, that she might conceal him in her chamber along with his sister, and in the room of little Day cooked up a young kid, very tender, which the ogress found to be wonderfully good. This was hitherto all mighty well, but one evening this wicked queen said to her clerk of the kitchen, "I will eat the queen with the same sauce I had with her children." It was now that the poor clerk of the kitchen despaired of being able to deceive her. The young queen was turned of 20, not reckoning the 100 years she had been asleep, and how to find in the yard a beast so firm was what puzzled him. He took then a resolution that he might save his own life to cut the queen's throat, and going up into her chamber with intent to do it at once, he put himself into as great fury as he could possibly, and came into the young queen's room with his dagger in his hand. He would not, however, surprise her, but told her, with a great deal of respect, the orders he had received from the Queen Mother. "Do it," said she, stretching out her neck. "Execute your orders, and then I shall go and see my children, my poor children, whom I so much and so tenderly loved," for she thought them dead ever since they had been taken away without her knowledge. "No, no, madam," cried the poor clerk of the kitchen, all in tears. "You shall not die. And yet you shall see your children again. But then you must go home with me to my lodgings, where I have concealed them, and I shall deceive the queen once more by giving her in your stead a young hind." Upon this he forthwith conducted her to his chamber, where, leaving her to embrace her children and cry along with them, he went and dressed a young hind, which the queen had for her supper, and devoured it with the same appetite as if it had been the young queen. Exceedingly was she delighted with her cruelty, and she had invented a story to tell the king, at his return, how the mad wolves had eaten up the queen, his wife, and her 2 children. One evening, as she was, according to her custom, rambling round about the courts and yards of the palace to see if she could smell any fresh meat, she heard, in a ground room, little Day crying. For his mamma was going to whip him because he had been naughty, and she heard, at the same time, little Morning begging pardon for her brother. The ogress presently knew the voice of the queen and her children, and being quite mad that she had been thus deceived, she commanded next morning, by break of day, with a most horrible voice, which made everybody tremble, that they should bring into the middle of the great court a large tub, which she caused to be filled with toads, vipers, snakes, and all sorts of serpents, in order to have thrown into it the queen and her children, the clerk of the kitchen, his wife, and maid, all whom she had given orders should be brought thither with their hands tied behind them. They were brought out accordingly, and the executioners were just going to throw them into the tub, when the king, who was not so soon expected, entered the court on horseback, for he came post and asked, with the utmost astonishment, what was the meaning of that horrible spectacle. No one dared to tell him, when the ogress, all enraged to see what had happened, threw herself head foremost into the tub, and was instantly devoured by the ugly creatures she had ordered to be thrown into it for others. The king could not but be very sorry, for she was his mother, but he soon comforted himself with his beautiful wife and his pretty children. The Story of Pretty Goldilocks. Once upon a time there was a princess who was the prettiest creature in the world, and because she was so beautiful, and because her hair was like the finest gold, and waved and rippled nearly to the ground, she was called Pretty Goldilocks. She always wore a crown of flowers, and her dresses were embroidered with diamonds and pearls, and everybody who saw her fell in love with her. Now, one of her neighbors was a young king who was not married. He was very rich and handsome, and when he heard all that was said about Pretty Goldilocks, though he had never seen her, he fell so deeply in love with her that he could neither eat nor drink. So he resolved to send an ambassador to ask her in marriage. He had a splendid carriage made for his ambassador, and gave him more than 100 horses and 100 servants, and told him to be sure and bring the princess back with him. After he had started, nothing else was talked of at court, and the king felt so sure that the princess would consent, that he set his people to work at pretty dresses and splendid furniture, that they might be ready by the time she came. Meanwhile, the ambassador arrived at the princess's palace and delivered his little message. But whether she happened to be cross that day, or whether the compliment did not please her, is not known. She only answered that she was very much obliged to the king, but she had no wish to be married. The ambassador set off sadly on his homeward way, bringing all the king's presents back with him, for the princess was too well brought up to accept the pearls and diamonds when she would not accept the king. So she had only kept 25 English pins, that he might not be vexed. When the ambassador reached the city, where the king was waiting impatiently, everybody was very much annoyed with him for not bringing the princess, and the king cried like a baby, and nobody could console him. Now there was at the court a young man who was more clever and handsome than anyone else. He was called Charming, and everyone loved him, excepting a few envious people who were angry at his being the king's favorite and knowing all the state secrets. He happened to one day be with some people who were speaking of the ambassador's return, and saying that his going to the princess had not done much good, when Charming said rashly, "If the king had sent me to the Princess Goldilocks, I am sure she would have come back with me." His enemies at once went to the king and said, "You will hardly believe, sire, what Charming has the audacity to say, that if he had been sent to the Princess Goldilocks, she would certainly have come back with him. He seems to think that he is so much handsomer than you that the princess would have fallen in love with him and followed him willingly." The king was very angry when he heard this. "Ha! Ha!" said he. "Does he laugh at my unhappiness and think himself more fascinating than I am? Go, and let him be shut up in my great tower to die of hunger." So the king's guards went to fetch Charming, who had thought no more of his rash speech, and carried him off to prison with great cruelty. The poor prisoner had only a little straw for his bed, and, but for a little stream of water which flowed through the tower, he would have died of thirst. One day, when he was in despair, he said to himself, "How can I have offended the king? I am his most faithful subject, and have done nothing against him." The king chanced to be passing the tower, and recognized the voice of his former favorite. He stopped to listen in spite of Charming's enemies, who tried to persuade him to have nothing more to do with the traitor. But the king said, "Be quiet, I wish to hear what he says." And then he opened the tower door and called to Charming, who came very sadly and kissed the king's hand, saying, "What have I done, sire, to deserve this cruel treatment?" "You mocked me and my ambassador," said the king, "and you said that if I had sent you for the Princess Goldilocks, you would certainly have brought her back." "It is quite true, sire," replied Charming. "I should have drawn such a picture of you, and represented your good qualities in such a way, that I am certain the princess would have found you irresistible. But I cannot see what there is in that to make you angry." The king could not see any cause for anger either, when the matter was presented to him in this light, and he began to frown very fiercely at the courtiers who had so misrepresented his favorite. So he took Charming back to the palace with him, and after seeing that he had a very good supper, he said to him, "You know that I love pretty Goldilocks as much as ever. Her refusal has not made any difference to me, but I don't know how to make her change her mind. I really should like to send you, to see if you can persuade her to marry me." Charming replied that he was perfectly willing to go, and would set out the very next day. "But you must wait till I can get a grand escort for you," said the king. But Charming said that he only wanted a good horse to ride, and the king, who was delighted at his being ready to start so promptly, gave him letters to the princess and bade him good speed. It was on a Monday morning that he set out all alone upon his errand, thinking of nothing but how he could persuade the Princess Goldilocks to marry the king. He had a writing book in his pocket, and whenever any happy thought struck him, he dismounted from his horse and sat down under the trees to put it into the harangue which he was preparing for the princess, before he forgot it. One day, when he had started at the very earliest dawn, and was riding over a great meadow, he suddenly had a capital idea, and, springing from his horse, he sat down under a willow tree which grew by a little river. When he had written it down, he was looking round him, pleased to find himself in such a pretty place, when all at once he saw a great golden cub lying gasping and exhausted upon the grass. In leaping after little flies, she had thrown herself high upon the bank, where she had lain till she was nearly dead. Charming had pity upon her, and, though he couldn't help thinking that she would have been very nice for dinner, he picked her up gently and put her back into the water. As soon as Dame Carp felt the refreshing coolness of the water, she sank down joyfully to the bottom of the river. Then, swimming up to the bank quite boldly, she said, "I thank you, Charming, for the kindness you have done me. You have saved my life. One day I will repay you." So saying, she sank down into the water again, leaving Charming greatly astonished at her politeness. Another day, as he journeyed on, he saw a raven in great distress. The poor bird was closely pursued by an eagle, which would soon have eaten it up, had not Charming quickly fitted an arrow to his bow and shot the eagle dead. The raven perched upon a tree very joyfully. "Charming," said he, "it was very generous of you to rescue a poor raven. I am not ungrateful. Some day I will repay you." Charming thought it was very nice of the raven to say so, and went on his way. Before the sun rose, he found himself in a thick wood, where it was too dark for him to see his path. And here he heard an owl crying, as if it were in despair. "Hark!" said he, "that must be an owl in great trouble. I am sure it has gone into a snare." And he began to hunt about, and presently found a great net which some bird-catchers had spread the night before. "What a pity it is that men do nothing but torment and persecute poor creatures which never do them any harm," said he, and he took out his knife and cut the cords of the net, and the owl flitted away into the darkness. But then turning, with one flicker of her wings, she came back to Charming and said, "It does not need many words to tell you how great a service you have done me. I was caught. In a few minutes the fowlers would have been here. Without your help I should have been killed. I am grateful, and one day I will repay you." These 3 adventures were the only ones of any consequence that befell Charming upon his journey, and he made all the haste he could to reach the palace of the Princess Goldilocks. When he arrived, he thought everything he saw delightful and magnificent. Diamonds were as plentiful as pebbles, and the gold and silver, the beautiful dresses, the sweetmeats and pretty things that were everywhere quite amazed him. He thought to himself, "If the princess consents to leave all this and come with me to marry the king, he may think himself lucky." Then he dressed himself carefully in rich brocade, with scarlet and white plumes, and threw a splendid embroidered scarf over his shoulder, and, looking as gay and as graceful as possible, he presented himself at the door of the palace, carrying in his arm a tiny pretty dog, which he had bought on the way. The guards saluted him respectfully, and a messenger was sent to the princess to announce the arrival of Charming as ambassador of her neighbor, the king. "Charming," said the princess. "The name promises well. I have no doubt that he is good-looking and fascinates everybody." "Indeed he does, madam," said all her maids of honor in one breath. "We saw him from the window of the garret where we were spinning flax, and we could do nothing but look at him as long as he was in sight." "Well, to be sure," said the princess, "that's how you amuse yourselves, is it? Looking at strangers out of the window. Be quick, and give me my blue satin-embroidered dress, and comb out my golden hair. Let somebody make me fresh garlands of flowers, and give me my high-heeled shoes and my fan, and tell them to sweep my great hall and my throne, for I want everyone to say I am really pretty Goldilocks." You can imagine how all her maids scurried this way and that to make the princess ready, and how in their haste they knocked their heads together and hindered each other, till she thought they would never have done. However, at last they led her into the gallery of mirrors, that she might assure herself that nothing was lacking in her appearance. And then she mounted her throne of gold, ebony, and ivory, while her ladies took their guitars and began to sing softly. Then Charming was led in, and was so struck with astonishment and admiration that at first not a word could he say. But presently he took courage and delivered his harangue, bravely ending by begging the princess to spare him the disappointment of going back without her. "Sir Charming," answered she, "all the reasons you have given me are very good ones, and I assure you that I should have more pleasure in obliging you than anyone else. But you must know that a month ago, as I was walking by the river with my ladies, I took off my glove, and as I did so, a ring that I was wearing slipped off my finger and rolled into the water. As I valued it more than my kingdom, you may imagine how vexed I was at losing it, and I vowed to never listen to any proposal of marriage unless the ambassador first brought me back my ring. So now you know what is expected of you, for if you talked for 15 days and 15 nights, you could not make me change my mind." Charming was very much surprised by this answer, but he bowed low to the princess and begged her to accept the embroidered scarf and the tiny dog he had brought with him. But she answered that she did not want any presents, and that he was to remember what she had just told him. When he got back to his lodging, he went to bed without eating any supper, and his little dog, who was called Frisk, couldn't eat any either, but came and lay down close to him. All night Charming sighed and lamented. "How am I to find a ring that fell into the river a month ago?" said he. "It is useless to try. The princess must have told me to do it on purpose, knowing it was impossible." And then he sighed again. Frisk heard him and said, "My dear master, don't despair. The luck may change. You are too good not to be happy. Let us go down to the river as soon as it is light." But Charming only gave him 2 little pats and said nothing, and very soon he fell asleep. At the first glimmer of dawn, Frisk began to jump about, and when he had waked Charming, they went out together, first into the garden, and then down to the river's brink, where they wandered up and down. Charming was thinking sadly of having to go back unsuccessful, when he heard someone calling, "Charming! Charming!" He looked all about him and thought he must be dreaming, as he could not see anybody. Then he walked on, and the voice called again, "Charming! Charming!" "Who calls me?" said he. Frisk, who was very small and could look closely into the water, cried out, "I see a golden carp coming." And sure enough, there was the great carp, who said to Charming, "You saved my life in the meadow by the willow tree, and I promised that I would repay you. Take this. It is Princess Goldilocks' ring." Charming took the ring out of Dame Carp's mouth, thanking her 1,000 times, and he and Tiny Frisk went straight to the palace, where someone told the princess that he was asking to see her. "Ah, poor fellow," said she, "he must have come to say good-bye, finding it impossible to do as I asked." So in came Charming, who presented her with the ring and said, "Madam, I have done your bidding. Will it please you to marry my master?" When the princess saw her ring brought back to her unhurt, she was so astonished that she thought she must be dreaming. "Truly, Charming," said she, "you must be the favourite of some fairy, or you could never have found it." "Madam," answered he, "I was helped by nothing but my desire to obey your wishes." "Since you are so kind," said she, "perhaps you will do me another service, for till it is done I will never be married. There is a prince not far from here, whose name is Galifron, who once wanted to marry me, but when I refused he uttered the most terrible threats against me, and vowed that he would lay waste my country. But what could I do? I could not marry a frightful giant as tall as a tower, who eats up people as a monkey eats chestnuts, and who talks so loud that anybody who has to listen to him becomes quite deaf. Nevertheless, he does not cease to persecute me and to kill my subjects, so before I can listen to your proposal, you must kill him and bring me his head." Charming was rather dismayed at this command, but he answered, "Very well, Princess. I will fight this Gallifron. I believe that he will kill me, but at any rate I shall die in your defense." Then the princess was frightened and said everything she could think of to prevent Charming from fighting the giant, but it was of no use, and he went out to arm himself suitably, and then, taking little Frisk with him, he mounted his horse and set out for Gallifron's country. Everyone he met told him what a terrible giant Gallifron was, and that nobody dared go near him, and the more he heard, the more frightened he grew. Frisk tried to encourage him by saying, "While you are fighting the giant, dear master, I will go and bite his heels, and when he stoops down to look at me, you can kill him." Charming praised his little dog's plan, but knew that this help would not do much good. At last he drew near the giant's castle, and saw to his horror that every path that led to it was strewn with bones. Before long he saw Gallifron coming. His head was higher than the tallest trees, and he sang in a terrible voice, "Bring out your little boys and girls, pray do not stay to do their curls. For I shall eat so very many, I shall not know if they have any." Thereupon Charming sang out as loud as he could to the same tune, "Come out and meet the valiant Charming, who finds you not at all alarming. Although he is not very tall, he is big enough to make you fall." The rhymes were not very correct, but you see he had made them up so quickly that it is a miracle that they were not worse, especially as he was horribly frightened all the time. When Gallifron heard these words, he looked all about him and saw Charming standing, sword in hand. This put the giant into a terrible rage, and he aimed a blow at Charming with his huge iron club, which would certainly have killed him if it had reached him. But at that instant a raven perched upon the giant's head, and, pecking with its strong beak and beating with its great wings, so confused and blinded him that all his blows fell harmlessly upon the air. And Charming, rushing in, gave him several strokes with his sharp sword, so that he fell to the ground. Whereupon Charming cut off his head before he knew anything about it, and the raven from a tree close by croaked out, "You see, I have not forgotten the good turn you did me in killing the eagle. Today I think I have fulfilled my promise of repaying you." "Indeed, I owe you more gratitude than you ever owed me," replied Charming, and then he mounted his horse and rode off with Gallifron's head. When he reached the city, the people ran after him in crowds, crying, "Behold the brave Charming! Who has killed the giant?" And their shouts reached the princess's ear, but she dared not ask what was happening, for fear she should hear that Charming had been killed. But very soon he arrived at the palace with the giant's head, of which she was still terrified, though it could no longer do her any harm. "Princess," said Charming, "I have killed your enemy. I hope you will now consent to marry the king, my master." "Oh dear, no," said the princess. "Not until you have brought me some water from the gloomy cavern. Not far from here there is a deep cave, the entrance to which is guarded by 2 dragons with fiery eyes who will not allow anyone to pass them. When you get into the cavern, you will find an immense hole, which you must go down, and it is full of toads and snakes. At the bottom of this hole there is another little cave, in which rises the fountain of health and beauty. It is some of this water that I really must have. Everything it touches becomes wonderful. The beautiful things will always remain beautiful, and the ugly things become lovely. If one is young, one never grows old, and if one is old, one becomes young. You see, Charming, I could not leave my kingdom without taking some of it with me." "Princess," said he, "you at least can never need this water, but I am an unhappy ambassador, whose death you desire. Where you send me I will go, though I know I shall never return." And, as the Princess Goldilocks showed no sign of relenting, He started with his little dog for the Bumy Cavern. Everyone he met on the way said, "What a pity that a handsome young man should throw away his life so carelessly. He is going to the cavern alone, though if he had 100 men with him he could not succeed." "Why does the princess ask impossibilities?" Charming said nothing, but he was very sad. When he was near the top of a hill, he dismounted to let his horse graze, while Frisk amused himself by chasing flies. Charming knew he could not be far from the gloomy cavern, and on looking about him, he saw a black, hideous rock from which came a thick smoke, followed in a moment by one of the dragons with fire blazing from his mouth and eyes. His body was yellow and green, and his claws scarlet, and his tail was so long that it lay in 100 coils. Frisk was so terrified at the sight of it that he did not know where to hide. Charming, quite determined to get the water or die, now drew his sword and, taking the crystal flask which pretty Goldilocks had given him to fill, said to Frisk, "I feel sure that I shall never come back from this expedition. When I am dead, go to the princess and tell her that her errand has cost me my life. Then find the king my master and relate all my adventures to him." As he spoke, he heard a voice calling, "Charming, Charming!" "Who calls me?" said he. Then he saw an owl sitting in a hollow tree, who said to him, "You saved my life when I was caught in the net. Now I can repay you. Trust me with the flask, for I know all the ways of the gloomy cavern and can fill it from the fountain of beauty." Charming was only too glad to give her the flask, and she flitted into the cavern quite unnoticed by the dragon, and after some time returned with the flask filled to the very brim with sparkling water. Charming thanked her with all his heart and joyfully hastened back to the town. He went straight to the palace and gave the flask to the princess, who had no further objection to make. So she thanked Charming and ordered that preparations should be made for her departure, and they soon set out together. The princess found Charming such an agreeable companion that she sometimes said to him, "Why didn't we stay where we were? I could have made you king, and we should have been so happy." But Charming only answered, "I could not have done anything that would have vexed my master so much, even for a kingdom, or to please you, though I think you are as beautiful as the sun." At last they reached the king's great city, and he came out to meet the princess, bringing magnificent presents, and the marriage was celebrated with great rejoicings. But Goldilocks was so fond of Charming that she could not be happy unless he was near her, and she was always singing his praises. "If it hadn't been for Charming," she said to the king, "I should never have come here. You ought to be very much obliged to him, for he did the most impossible things and got me water from the fountain of beauty, so I can never grow old, and shall get prettier every year." Then Charming's enemies said to the king, "It is a wonder that you are not jealous. The queen thinks there is nobody in the world like Charming. As if anybody you had sent could not have done just as much." "It is quite true." "Now I come to think of it," said the king, "let him be chained hand and foot and thrown into the tower." So they took Charming, and as a reward for having served the king so faithfully, he was shut up in the tower, where he only saw the jailer, who brought him a piece of black bread and a pitcher of water every day. However, little Frisk came to console him and told him all the news. When pretty Goldilocks heard what had happened, she threw herself at the king's feet and begged him to set Charming free. But the more she cried, the more angry he was, and at last she saw that it was useless to say any more, but it made her very sad. Then the king took it into his head that perhaps he was not handsome enough to please the Princess Goldilocks, and he thought he would bathe his face with the water from the fountain of beauty, which was in the flask on a shelf in the princess's room, where she had placed it, that she might see it often. Now it happened that one of the princess's ladies in chasing a spider had knocked the flask off the shelf and broken it, and every drop of the water had been spilt. Not knowing what to do, she had hastily swept away the pieces of crystal, and then remembered that in the king's room she had seen a flask of exactly the same shape, also filled with sparkling water. So, without saying a word, she fetched it and stood it upon the queen's shelf. Now the water in this flask was what was used in the kingdom for getting rid of troublesome people. Instead of having their heads cut off in the usual way, their faces were bathed with the water, and they instantly fell asleep and never woke up any more. So, when the king, thinking to improve his beauty, took the flask and sprinkled the water upon his face, he fell asleep, and nobody could wake him. Little Frisk was the first to hear the news, and he ran to tell Charming, who sent him to beg the princess not to forget the poor prisoner. All the palace was in confusion on account of the king's death, but tiny Frisk made his way through the crowd to the princess's side and said, "Madam, do not forget poor Charming." Then she remembered all he had done for her, and without saying a word to anyone went straight to the tower, and with her own hands took off Charming's chains. Then, putting a golden crown upon his head and the royal mantle upon his shoulders, she said, "Come, faithful Charming, I make you king, and will take you for my husband." Charming, once more free and happy, fell at her feet and thanked her for her gracious words. Everybody was delighted that he should be king, and the wedding, which took place at once, was the prettiest that can be imagined, and Prince Charming and Princess Goldilocks lived happily ever after. The story of Prince Ahmed and the fairy Paribanu. There was a sultan who had 3 sons and a niece. The eldest of the princes was called Hussan, the second Ali, the youngest Ahmed, and the princess, his niece Nouronihar. The Princess Nouronihar was the daughter of the younger brother of the Sultan, who died and left the princess very young. The Sultan took upon himself the care of his daughter's education and brought her up in his palace with the 3 princes, proposing to marry her when she arrived at a proper age, and to contract an alliance with some neighbouring prince by that means. But when he perceived that the 3 princes, his sons, loved her passionately, he thought more seriously on that affair. He was very much concerned. The difficulty he foresaw was to make them agree, and that the 2 youngest should consent to yield her up to their elder brother. As he found them positively obstinate, he sent for them all together and said to them, "Children, since for your good and quiet I have not been able to persuade you no longer to aspire to the princess, your cousin, I think it would not be amiss if everyone travelled separately into different countries, so that you might not meet each other. And, as you know, I am very curious, and delight in everything that's singular. I promise my niece in marriage to him that shall bring me the most extraordinary rarity, and for the purchase of the rarity you shall go in search after, and the expense of travelling, I will give you everyone a sum of money." As the 3 princes were always submissive and obedient to the Sultan's will, and each flattered himself fortune might prove favourable to him, they all consented to it. The Sultan paid them the money he promised them, and that very day they gave orders for the preparations for their travels, and took their leave of the Sultan, that they might be the more ready to go the next morning. Accordingly, they all set out at the same gate of the city, each dressed like a merchant, attended by an officer of confidence dressed like a slave, and all well mounted and equipped. They went the first day's journey together, and lay all at an inn, where the road was divided into 3 different tracts. At night, when they were at supper together, they all agreed to travel for a year, and to meet at that inn, and that the first that came should wait for the rest, that As they had all three taken their leave together of the Sultan, they might all return together. The next morning, by break of day, after they had embraced and wished each other good success, they mounted their horses and took each a different road. Prince Hussein, the eldest brother, arrived at Bisnagar, the capital of the kingdom of that name and the residence of its king. He went and lodged at a khan appointed for foreign merchants, and, having learned that there were 4 principal divisions where merchants of all sorts sold their commodities and kept shops, and in the midst of which stood the castle, or rather the king's palace, he went to one of these divisions the next day. Prince Hussein could not view this division without admiration. It was large, and divided into several streets, all vaulted and shaded from the sun, and yet very light too. The shops were all of a size, and all that dealt in the same sort of goods lived in one street, as also the handicrafts, men who kept their shops in the smaller streets. The multitude of shops, stocked with all sorts of merchandise, as the finest linens from several parts of India, some painted in the most lively colours and representing beasts, trees, and flowers, silks and brocades from Persia, China, and other places, porcelain both from Japan and China, and tapestries, surprised him so much that he knew not how to believe his own eyes. But when he came to the goldsmiths and jewellers, he was in a kind of ecstasy to behold such prodigious quantities of wrought gold and silver, and was dazzled by the lustre of the pearls, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and other jewels exposed to sale. Another thing Prince Hussein particularly admired was the great number of rose sellers who crowded the streets. For the Indians are so great lovers of that flower that no one will stir without a nosegay in his hand or a garland on his head, and the merchants keep them in pots in their shops, that the air is perfectly perfumed. After Prince Hussein had run through that division, street by street, his thoughts fully employed on the riches he had seen, he was very much tired, which a merchant perceiving, civilly invited him to sit down in his shop, and he accepted, but had not been sat down long before he saw a crier pass by with a piece of tapestry on his arm, about 6 feet square, and cried at 30 purses. The prince called to the crier and asked to see the tapestry, which seemed to him to be valued at an exorbitant price, not only for the size of it, but the meanness of the stuff. When he had examined it well, he told the crier that he could not comprehend how so small a piece of tapestry, and of so indifferent appearance, could be set at so high a price. The crier, who took him for a merchant, replied, "If this price seems so extravagant to you, your amazement will be greater when I tell you I have orders to raise it to 40 purses, and not to part with it under." "Certainly," answered Prince Hussein, "it must have something very extraordinary in it, which I know nothing of." "You have guessed it, sir," replied the crier, "and will own it, when you come to know that whoever sits on this piece of tapestry may be transported in an instant wherever he desires to be, without being stopped by any obstacle." At this discourse of the crier, the Prince of the Indies, considering that the principal motive of his travel was to carry the Sultan, his father, home, some singular rarity, thought that he could not meet with any which could give him more satisfaction. "If the tapestry," said he to the crier, "has the virtue you assign it, I shall not think 40 purses too much, but shall make you a present besides." "Sir," replied the crier, "I have told you the truth, and it is an easy matter to convince you of it, as soon as you have made the bargain for 40 purses, on condition I show you the experiment. But, as I suppose you have not so much about you, and to receive them I must go with you to your khan, where you lodge. With the leave of the master of the shop, we will go into the back shop, and I will spread the tapestry, and when we have both sat down, and you have formed the wish to be transported into your apartment of the Khan. If we are not transported thither, it shall be no bargain, and you shall be at your liberty. As to your present, though I am paid for my trouble by the seller, I shall receive it as a favour, and be very much obliged to you and thankful." On the credit of the crier, the prince accepted the conditions and concluded the bargain, and, having got the master's leave, they went into his back shop. They both sat down on it, and as soon as the prince formed his wish to be transported into his apartment at the Khan, he presently found himself and the crier there, and, as he wanted not a more sufficient proof of the virtue of the tapestry, he counted the crier out 40 pieces of gold, and gave him 20 pieces for himself. In this manner, Prince Hussein became the possessor of the tapestry, and was overjoyed that at his arrival at Bisnagar he had found so rare a piece, which he never disputed would gain him the hand of Nouronihar. In short, he looked upon it as an impossible thing for the princes, his younger brothers, to meet with anything to be compared with it. It was in his power, by sitting on his tapestry, to be at the place of meeting that very day. But, as he was obliged to stay there for his brothers, as they had agreed, and as he was curious to see the king of Bisnagar and his court, and to inform himself of the strength, laws, customs, and religion of the kingdom, he chose to make a longer abode there, and to spend some months in satisfying his curiosity. Prince Hussein might have made a longer abode in the kingdom and court of Bisnagar, but he was so eager to be nearer the princess that, spreading the tapestry, he and the officer he had brought with him sat down, and, as soon as he had formed his wish, were transported to the inn at which he and his brothers were to meet, and where he passed for a merchant till they came. Prince Ali, Prince Hussein's second brother, who designed to travel into Persia, took the road, having 3 days, after he parted with his brothers, joined a caravan, and after 4 days' travel arrived at Shiraz, which was the capital of the kingdom of Persia. Here he passed for a jeweller. The next morning Prince Ali, who travelled only for his pleasure, and had brought nothing but just necessaries along with him, after he had dressed himself, took a walk into that part of the town which they at Shiraz called the Bezestein. Among all the criers who passed backward and forward with several sorts of goods, offering to sell them, he was not a little surprised to see one who held an ivory telescope in his hand, of about 1 foot in length, and the thickness of a man's thumb, and cried it at 30 purses. At first he thought the crier mad, and to inform himself went to a shop, and said to the merchant who stood at the door, "Pray, sir, is not that man," pointing to the crier who cried the ivory perspective glass at 30 purses mad? "If he is not, I am very much deceived." "Indeed, sir," answered the merchant, "he was in his right senses yesterday. I can assure you he is one of the ablest criers we have, and the most employed of any when anything valuable is to be sold. And if he cries, 'The ivory perspective glass at 30 purses,' it must be worth as much or more, on some account or other. He will come by presently, and we will call him, and you shall be satisfied. In the meantime, sit down on my sofa, and rest yourself." Prince Ali accepted the merchant's obliging offer, and presently afterward the crier passed by. The merchant called him by his name, and, pointing to the prince, said to him, "Tell that gentleman who asked me if you were in your right senses what you mean by crying that ivory perspective glass, which seems not to be worth much, at 30 purses. I should be very much amazed myself if I did not know you." The crier, addressing himself to Prince Ali, said, "Sir, you are not the only person that takes me for a madman on account of this perspective glass. You shall judge yourself whether I am or no, when I have told you its property, and I hope you will value it at as high a price as those I have showed it to already, who had as bad an opinion of me as you." "First, sir," pursued the crier, presenting the ivory pipe to the prince, "observe that this pipe is furnished with a glass at both ends, and consider that by looking through one of them you see whatever object you wish to behold." "I am," said the prince, "ready to make you all imaginable reparation for the scandal I have thrown on you, if you will make the truth of what you advance appear." And as he had the ivory pipe in his hand, after he had looked at the two glasses, he said, "Show me at which of these ends I must look that I may be satisfied." The crier presently showed him, and he looked through, wishing at the same time to see the Sultan. His father, whom he immediately beheld in perfect health, sat on his throne in the midst of his council. Afterward, as there was nothing in the world so dear to him, after the Sultan, as the Princess Nouronihar, he wished to see her, and saw her at her toilet laughing, and in a pleasant humour with her women about her. Prince Ali wanted no other proof to be persuaded that this perspective glass was the most valuable thing in the world, and believed that if he should neglect to purchase it, he should never meet again with such another rarity. He therefore took the crier with him to the Khan, where he lodged, and counted him out the money, and received the perspective glass. Prince Ali was overjoyed at his bargain, and persuaded himself that, as his brothers would not be able to meet with anything so rare and admirable, the Princess Nouronihar would be the recompense of his fatigue and trouble, that he thought of nothing but visiting the court of Persia incognito, and seeing whatever was curious in Shiraz and thereabouts, till the caravan with which he came returned back to the Indies. As soon as the caravan was ready to set out, the prince joined them, and arrived happily without any accident or trouble, otherwise than the length of the journey and fatigue of travelling, at the place of rendezvous, where he found Prince Hussein, and both waited for Prince Ahmed. Prince Ahmed, who took the road of Samarkand the next day after his arrival there, went, as his brothers had done, into the Bezestein, where he had not walked long but heard a crier, who had an artificial apple in his hand, cry it at 35 purses, upon which he stopped the crier, and said to him, "Let me see that apple, and tell me what virtue and extraordinary properties it has, to be valued at so high a rate." "Sir," said the crier, giving it into his hand, "if you look at the outside of this apple, it is very worthless, but if you consider its properties, virtues, and the great use and benefit it is to mankind, you will say it is no price for it, and that he who possesses it is master of a great treasure. In short, it cures all sick persons of the most mortal diseases, and if the patient is dying, it will recover him immediately and restore him to perfect health. And this is done after the easiest manner in the world, which is by the patient smelling the apple." "If I may believe you," replied Prince Ahmed, "the virtues of this apple are wonderful, and it is invaluable. But what ground have I, for all you tell me, to be persuaded of the truth of this matter?" "Sir," replied the crier, "the thing is known and averred by the whole city of Samarkand. But, without going any further, ask all these merchants you see here, and hear what they say. You will find several of them will tell you they had not been alive this day if they had not made use of this excellent remedy. And, that you may better comprehend what it is, I must tell you, it is the fruit of the study and experiments of a celebrated philosopher of this city, who applied himself all his lifetime to the study and knowledge of the virtues of plants and minerals, and at last attained to this composition, by which he performed such surprising cures in this town as will never be forgot, but died suddenly himself, before he could apply his sovereign remedy, and left his wife and a great many young children behind him in very indifferent circumstances, who, to support her family and provide for her children, is resolved to sell it. While the crier informed Prince Ahmed of the virtues of the artificial apple, a great many persons came about them and confirmed what he said, and one among the rest said he had a friend dangerously ill, whose life was despaired of, and that was a favourable opportunity to show Prince Ahmed the experiment. Upon which Prince Ahmed told the crier he would give him 40 purses if he cured the sick person. The crier, who had orders to sell it at that price, said to Prince Ahmed, "Come, sir, let us go and make the experiment, and the apple shall be yours, and I can assure you that it will always have the desired effect." In short, the experiment succeeded, and the prince, after he had counted out to the crier 40 purses, and he had delivered the apple to him, waited patiently for the first caravan that should return to the Indies, and arrived in perfect health at the inn where the Princes Hussein and Ali waited for him. When the princes met, they showed each other their treasures, and immediately saw through the glass that the princess was dying. They then sat down on the carpet, wished themselves with her, and were there in a moment. Prince Ahmed no sooner perceived himself in Nouronihar's chamber than he rose off the tapestry, as did also the other 2 princes, and went to the bedside and put the apple under her nose. Some moments after, the princess opened her eyes and turned her head from one side to another, looking at the persons who stood about her, and then rose up in the bed and asked to be dressed, just as if she had waked out of a sound sleep. Her women having presently informed her, in a manner that showed their joy, that she was obliged to the 3 princes for the sudden recovery of her health, and particularly to Prince Ahmed, she immediately expressed her joy to see them and thanked them all together, and afterward Prince Ahmed in particular. While the princess was dressing, the princes went to throw themselves at the Sultan, their father's feet, and pay their respects to him. But when they came before him, they found he had been informed of their arrival by the chief of the princess's eunuchs, and by what means the princess had been perfectly cured. The Sultan received and embraced them with the greatest joy, both for their return and the recovery of the princess his niece, whom he loved as well as if she had been his own daughter, and who had been given over by the physicians. After the usual ceremonies and compliments, the princes presented each his rarity, Prince Hussein his tapestry, which he had taken care not to leave behind him in the princess's chamber, Prince Ali his ivory perspective glass, and Prince Ahmed his artificial apple, and after each had commended their present when they put it into the Sultan's hands, they begged of him to pronounce their fate, and declare to which of them he would give the Princess Nouronihar for a wife, according to his promise. The Sultan of the Indies, having heard, without interrupting them, all that the princes could represent further about their rarities, and being well informed of what had happened in relation to the Princess Nouronihar's cure, remained some time silent, as if he were thinking on what answer he should make. At last he broke the silence, and said to them, "I would declare for one of you children with a great deal of pleasure if I could do it with justice. But consider whether I can do it or no. 'Tis true, Prince Ahmed, the princess my niece is obliged to your artificial apple for her cure, but I must ask you whether or no you could have been so serviceable to her if you had not known by Prince Ali's perspective glass the danger she was in, and if Prince Hussein's tapestry had not brought you so soon. Your perspective glass, Prince Ali, informed you and your brothers that you were like to lose the princess your cousin, and there you must own a great obligation. You must also grant that that knowledge would have been of no service without the artificial apple and the tapestry. And lastly, Prince Hussein, the princess would be very ungrateful if she should not show her acknowledgment of the service of your tapestry, which was so necessary a means toward her cure. But consider, it would have been of little use if you had not been acquainted with the princess's illness by Prince Ali's glass, and Prince Ahmed had not applied his artificial apple. Therefore, as neither tapestry, ivory perspective glass nor artificial apple have the least preference one before the other, but, on the contrary, there's a perfect equality. I cannot grant the princess to any one of you, and the only fruit you have reaped from your travels is the glory of having equally contributed to restore her health. If all this be true, added the Sultan, you see that I must have recourse to other means to determine certainly in the choice I ought to make among you, and that, as there is time enough between this and night, I'll do it today. Go and get each of you a bow and arrow, and repair to the great plain, where they exercise horses. I'll soon come to you, and declare I will give the Princess Nouronihar to him that shoots the farthest. The three princes had nothing to say against the decision of the Sultan. When they were out of his presence, they each provided themselves with a bow and arrow, which they delivered to one of their officers and went to the plain appointed, followed by a great concourse of people. The Sultan did not make them wait long for him, and as soon as he arrived, Prince Hussein, as the eldest, took his bow and arrow and shot first, Prince Ali shot next, and much beyond him, and Prince Ahmed last of all. But it so happened that nobody could see where his arrow fell, and, notwithstanding all the diligence that was used by himself and everybody else, it was not to be found far or near. And though it was believed that he shot the farthest, and that he therefore deserved the Princess Nouronihar, it was, however, necessary that his arrow should be found to make the matter more evident and certain. And, notwithstanding his remonstrance, the Sultan judged in favor of Prince Ali, and gave orders for preparations to be made for the wedding, which was celebrated a few days after with great magnificence. Prince Hussein would not honor the feast with his presence. In short, his grief was so violent and insupportable that he left the court and renounced all right of succession to the crown to turn hermit. Prince Ahmed, too, did not come to Prince Ali's and the Princess Nouronihar's wedding any more than his brother Hussein, but did not renounce the world as he had done. But, as he could not imagine what had become of his arrow, he stole away from his attendants and resolved to search after it, that he might not have anything to reproach himself with. With this intent, he went to the place where the Princes Hussein's and Ali's were gathered up, and, going straight forward from there, looking carefully on both sides of him, he went so far that at last he began to think his labor was all in vain. But yet he could not help going forward till he came to some steep, craggy rocks, which were bounds to his journey and were situated in a barren country, about 4 leagues distant from where he set out. When Prince Ahmed came pretty nigh to these rocks, he perceived an arrow, which he gathered up, looked earnestly at it, and was in the greatest astonishment to find it was the same he shot away. "Certainly," said he to himself, "neither I nor any man living could shoot an arrow so far," and, finding it laid flat, not sticking into the ground, he judged that it rebounded against the rock. "There must be some mystery in this," said he to himself again, "and it may be advantageous to me. Perhaps fortune, to make me amends for depriving me of what I thought the greatest happiness, may have reserved a greater blessing for my comfort." As these rocks were full of caves, and some of those caves were deep, the prince entered into one, and, looking about, cast his eyes on an iron door, which seemed to have no lock, but he feared it was fastened. However, thrusting against it, it opened and discovered an easy descent, but no steps, which he walked down with his arrow in his hand. At first he thought he was going into a dark, obscure place, but presently a quite different light succeeded that which he came out of, and, entering into a large, spacious place, at about 50 or 60 paces distant, he perceived a magnificent palace, which he had not then time enough to look at. At the same time, a lady of majestic port and air advanced as far as the porch, attended by a large troop of ladies, so finely dressed and beautiful that it was difficult to distinguish which was the mistress. As soon as Prince Ahmed perceived the lady, he made all imaginable haste to go and pay his respects, and the lady, on her part, seeing him coming, prevented him from addressing his discourse to her first, but said to him, "Come nearer, Prince Ahmed, you are welcome." It was no small surprise to the prince to hear himself named in a place he had never heard of, though so nigh to his father's capital, and he could not comprehend how he should be known to a lady who was a stranger to him. At last he returned the lady's compliment by throwing himself at her feet, and, rising up again, said to her, "Madam, I return you 1,000 thanks for the assurance you give me of a welcome to a place where I believed my imprudent curiosity had made me penetrate too far. But, madam, may I, without being guilty of ill manners, dare to ask you by what adventure you know me, and how you, who live in the same neighborhood with me, should be so great a stranger to me?" "Prince," said the lady, "let us go into the hall. There I will gratify you in your request." After these words, the lady led Prince Ahmed into the hall. Then she sat down on a sofa, and when the prince by her entreaty had done the same, she said, "You are surprised, you say, that I should know you and not be known by you, but you will be no longer surprised when I inform you who I am. You are undoubtedly sensible that your religion teaches you to believe that the world is inhabited by genies as well as men. I am the daughter of one of the most powerful and distinguished genies, and my name is Paribanu. The only thing that I have to add is that you seemed to me worthy of a more happy fate than that of possessing the Princess Nouronihar, and that you might attain to it. I was present when you drew your arrow, and foresaw it would not go beyond Prince Hyacinth. I took it in the air, and gave it the necessary motion to strike against the rocks near which you found it, and I tell you that it lies in your power to make use of the favorable opportunity which presents itself to make you happy." As the fairy Paribanu pronounced these last words with a different tone, and looked, at the same time, tenderly upon Prince Ahmed, with a modest blush on her cheeks, it was no hard matter for the prince to comprehend what happiness she meant. He presently considered that the Princess Nouronihar could never be his, and that the fairy Paribanu excelled her infinitely in beauty, agreeableness, wit, and, as much as he could conjecture by the magnificence of the palace, in immense riches. He blessed the moment that he thought of seeking after his arrow a second time, and, "Yielding to his love, madam," replied he, "should I all my life have the happiness of being your slave and the admirer of the many charms which ravish my soul, I should think myself the most blessed of men. Pardon in me the boldness which inspires me to ask this favor, and don't refuse to admit me into your court, a prince who is entirely devoted to you." "Prince," answered the fairy, "will you not pledge your faith to me as well as I give mine to you?" "Yes, madam," replied the prince in an ecstasy of joy. "What can I do better, and with greater pleasure?" "Yes, my sultaness, my queen, I'll give you my heart without the least reserve." "Then," answered the fairy, "you are my husband, and I am your wife. But, as I suppose," pursued she, "that you have eaten nothing today, a slight repast shall be served up for you, while preparations are making for our wedding feast at night, and then I will show you the apartments of my palace, and you shall judge if this hall is not the meanest part of it." Some of the fairy's women, who came into the hall with them and guessed her intentions, went immediately out and returned presently with some excellent meats and wines. When Prince Ahmed had ate and drunk as much as he cared for, The fairy Paribanu carried him through all the apartments, where he saw diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and all sorts of fine jewels, intermixed with pearls, agate, jasper, porphyry, and all sorts of the most precious marbles. But, not to mention the richness of the furniture, which was inestimable, there was such a profuseness throughout that the prince, instead of ever having seen anything like it, owned that he could not have imagined that there was anything in the world that could come up to it. "Prince," said the fairy, "if you admire my palace so much, which indeed is very beautiful, what would you say to the palaces of the chief of our genies, which are much more beautiful, spacious, and magnificent? I could also charm you with my gardens, but we will let that alone till another time. Night draws near, and it will be time to go to supper." The next hall which the fairy led the prince into, and where the cloth was laid for the feast, was the last apartment the prince had not seen, and not in the least inferior to the others. At his entrance into it, he admired the infinite number of sconces of wax candles perfumed with amber, the multitude of which, instead of being confused, were placed with so just a symmetry as formed an agreeable and pleasant sight. A large side table was set out with all sorts of gold plate, so finely wrought that the workmanship was much more valuable than the weight of the gold. Several choruses of beautiful women richly dressed, and whose voices were ravishing, began a concert, accompanied with all sorts of the most harmonious instruments, and when they were set down at table, the fairy Paribanu took care to help Prince Ahmed to the most delicate meats, which she named as she invited him to eat of them, and which the prince found to be so exquisitely nice that he commended them with exaggeration, and said that the entertainment far surpassed those of man. He found also the same excellence in the wines, which neither he nor the fairy tasted of till the dessert was served up, which consisted of the choicest sweetmeats and fruits. The wedding feast was continued the next day, or rather, the days following the celebration were a continual feast. At the end of 6 months, Prince Ahmed, who always loved and honored the Sultan his father, conceived a great desire to know how he was, and that desire could not be satisfied without his going to see. He told the fairy of it, and desired she would give him leave. "Prince," said she, "go when you please. But first, don't take it amiss that I give you some advice how you shall behave yourself where you are going. First, I don't think it proper for you to tell the Sultan your father of our marriage, nor of my quality, nor the place where you have been. Beg of him to be satisfied in knowing you are happy, and desire no more, and let him know that the sole end of your visit is to make him easy, and inform him of your fate." She appointed 20 gentlemen, well mounted and equipped, to attend him. When all was ready, Prince Ahmed took his leave of the fairy, embraced her, and renewed his promise to return soon. Then his horse, which was most finely caparisoned, and was as beautiful a creature as any in the Sultan of Indies' stables, was led to him, and he mounted him with an extraordinary grace, and, after he had bid her a last adieu, set forward on his journey. As it was not a great way to his father's capital, Prince Ahmed soon arrived there. The people, glad to see him again, received him with acclamations of joy, and followed him in crowds to the Sultan's apartment. The Sultan received and embraced him with great joy, complaining at the same time, with a fatherly tenderness, of the affliction his long absence had been to him, which he said was the more grievous for that, fortune having decided in favor of Prince Ali, his brother, he was afraid he might have committed some rash action. The prince told a story of his adventures without speaking of the fairy, whom he said that he must not mention, and ended, The only favor I ask of your majesty is to give me leave to come often and pay you my respects, and to know how you do." "Son," answered the Sultan of the Indies, "I cannot refuse you the leave you ask me, but I should much rather you would resolve to stay with me. At least tell me where I may send to you if you should fail to come, or when I may think your presence necessary." "Sir," replied Prince Ahmed, "what your majesty asks of me is part of the mystery I spoke to your majesty of. I beg of you to give me leave to remain silent on this head, for I shall come so frequently that I am afraid that I shall sooner be thought troublesome than be accused of negligence in my duty." The Sultan of the Indies pressed Prince Ahmed no more, but said to him, "Son, I penetrate no farther into your secrets, but leave you at your liberty, but can tell you that you could not do me a greater pleasure than to come, and by your presence restore to me the joy I have not felt this long time, and that you shall always be welcome when you come, without interrupting your business or pleasure." Prince Ahmed stayed but 3 days at the Sultan his father's court, and the 4th returned to the fairy Paribanu, who did not expect him so soon. A month after Prince Ahmed's return from paying a visit to his father, as the fairy Paribanu had observed that the prince, since the time that he gave her an account of his journey, his discourse with his father, and the leave he asked to go and see him often, had never talked of the Sultan, as if there had been no such person in the world, whereas before he was always speaking of him, she thought he forbore on her account. Therefore she took an opportunity to say to him one day, "Prince, tell me, have you forgot the Sultan your father? Don't you remember the promise you made to go and see him often? For my part, I have not forgot what you told me at your return, and so put you in mind of it, that you may not be long before you acquit yourself of your promise." So Prince Ahmed went the next morning with the same attendants as before, but much finer, and himself more magnificently mounted, equipped, and dressed, and was received by the Sultan with the same joy and satisfaction. For several months he constantly paid his visits, always in a richer and finer equipage. At last some viziers, the Sultan's favourites, who judged of Prince Ahmed's grandeur and power by the figure he cut, made the Sultan jealous of his son, saying it was to be feared he might inveigle himself into the people's favour and dethrone him. The Sultan of the Indies was so far from thinking that Prince Ahmed could be capable of so pernicious a design as his favourites would make him believe that he said to them, "You are mistaken. My son loves me, and I am certain of his tenderness and fidelity, as I have given him no reason to be disgusted." But the favourites went on abusing Prince Ahmed till the Sultan said, "Be it as it will, I don't believe my son Ahmed is so wicked as you would persuade me he is. However, I am obliged to you for your good advice, and don't dispute but that it proceeds from your good intentions." The Sultan of the Indies said this, that his favourites might not know the impressions their discourse had made on his mind, which had so alarmed him that he resolved to have Prince Ahmed watched unknown to his Grand Vizier. So he sent for a female magician, who was introduced by a back door into his apartment. "Go immediately," he said, "and follow my son, and watch him so well as to find out where he retires, and bring me word." The magician left the Sultan, and, knowing the place where Prince Ahmed found his arrow, went immediately thither, and hid herself near the rocks, so that nobody could see her. The next morning, Prince Ahmed set out by daybreak, without taking leave either of the Sultan or any of his court, according to custom. The magician, seeing him coming, followed him with her eyes, till on a sudden she lost sight of him and his attendants. As the rocks were very steep and craggy, They were an insurmountable barrier, so that the magician judged that there were but two things for it, either that the prince retired into some cavern, or an abode of genies or fairies. Thereupon she came out of the place where she was hid, and went directly to the hollow way, which she traced till she came to the farther end, looking carefully about on all sides, but, notwithstanding all her diligence, could perceive no opening, not so much as the iron gate which Prince Ahmed discovered, which was to be seen and opened to none but men, and only to such whose presence was agreeable to the fairy Paribanu. The magician, who saw it, was in vain for her to search any farther, was obliged to be satisfied with the discovery she had made, and returned to give the Sultan an account. The Sultan was very well pleased with the magician's conduct, and said to her, "Do you as you think fit. I'll wait patiently the event of your promises," and to encourage her made her a present of a diamond of great value. As Prince Ahmed had obtained the fairy Paribanu's leave to go to the Sultan of the Indies court once a month, he never failed, and the magician, knowing the time, went a day or two before to the foot of the rock where she lost sight of the prince and his attendants, and waited there. The next morning Prince Ahmed went out, as usual, at the iron gate with the same attendants as before, and passed by the magician, whom he knew not to be such, and, seeing her lie with her head against the rock, and complaining as if she were in great pain, he pitied her, turned his horse about, went to her, and asked her what was the matter with her, and what he could do to ease her. The artful sorceress looked at the prince in a pitiful manner, without ever lifting up her head, and answered in broken words and sighs, as if she could hardly fetch her breath, that she was going to the capital city, but on the way thither she was taken with so violent a fever that her strength failed her, and she was forced to lie down where he saw her, far from any habitation, and without any hopes of assistance. "Good woman," replied Prince Ahmed, "you are not so far from help as you imagine. I am ready to assist you, and convey you where you will meet with a speedy cure. Only get up, and let one of my people take you behind him." At these words, the magician, who pretended sickness only to know where the prince lived and what he did, refused not the charitable offer he made her, and that her actions might correspond with her words, she made many pretended vain endeavours to get up. At the same time, two of the prince's attendants, alighting off their horses, helped her up, and set her behind another, and mounted their horses again, and followed the prince, who turned back to the iron gate, which was opened by one of his retinue who rode before. And when he came into the outward court of the fairy, without dismounting himself, he sent to tell her he wanted to speak with her. The fairy Paribanu came with all imaginable haste, not knowing what made Prince Ahmed return so soon, who, not giving her time to ask him the reason, said, "Princess, I desire you would have compassion on this good woman," pointing to the magician, who was held up by two of his retinue. "I found her in the condition you see her in, and promised her the assistance she stands in need of, and am persuaded that you, out of your own goodness as well as upon my entreaty, will not abandon her." The fairy Paribanu, who had her eyes fixed upon the pretended sick woman all the time that the prince was talking to her, ordered two of her women who followed her to take her from the two men that held her, and carry her into an apartment of the palace, and take as much care of her as she would herself. While the two women executed the fairy's commands, she went up to Prince Ahmed and, whispering in his ear, said, "Prince, this woman is not so sick as she pretends to be, and I am very much mistaken if she is not an impostor, who will be the cause of a great trouble to you. But don't be concerned, let what will be devised against you. Be persuaded that I will deliver you out of all the snares that shall be laid for you. Go and pursue your journey." This discourse of the fairies did not in the least frighten Prince Ahmed. "My princess," said he, "as I do not remember I ever did or designed anybody an injury, I cannot believe anybody can have a thought of doing me one. But if they have, I shall not, nevertheless, forbear doing good whenever I have an opportunity." Then he went back to his father's palace. In the meantime, the two women carried the magician into a very fine apartment, richly furnished. First they sat her down upon a sofa, with her back supported with a cushion of gold brocade, while they made a bed on the same sofa before her, the quilt of which was finely embroidered with silk, the sheets of the finest linen, and the coverlet cloth of gold. When they had put her into bed, for the old sorceress pretended that her fever was so violent she could not help herself in the least. One of the women went out, and returned soon again with a china dish in her hand, full of a certain liquor, which she presented to the magician, while the other helped her to sit up. "Drink this liquor," said she. "It is the water of the Fountain of Lions, and a sovereign remedy against all fevers whatsoever. You will find the effect of it in less than an hour's time." The magician, to dissemble the better, took it after a great deal of entreaty, but at last she took the china dish, and, holding back her head, swallowed down the liquor. When she was laid down again, the two women covered her up. "Lie quiet," said she who brought her the china cup, "and get a little sleep if you can. We'll leave you, and hope to find you perfectly cured when we come again an hour hence." The two women came again at the time. They said they should, and found the magician up and dressed, and sitting upon the sofa. "Oh, admirable potion," she said, "it has wrought its cure much sooner than you told me it would, and I shall be able to prosecute my journey." The two women, who were fairies as well as their mistress, after they had told the magician how glad they were that she was cured so soon, walked before her and conducted her through several apartments, all more noble than that wherein she lay, into a large hall, the most richly and magnificently furnished of all the palace. Fairy Paribanu sat in this hall on a throne of massive gold, enriched with diamonds, rubies, and pearls of an extraordinary size, and attended on each hand by a great number of beautiful fairies, all richly clothed. At the sight of so much majesty, the magician was not only dazzled, but was so amazed that, after she had prostrated herself before the throne, she could not open her lips to thank the fairy as she proposed. However, Paribanu saved her the trouble, and said to her, "Good woman, I am glad I had an opportunity to oblige you, and to see you are able to pursue your journey. I won't detain you, but perhaps you may not be displeased to see my palace. Follow my women, and they will show it you." Then the magician went back and related to the Sultan of the Indies all that had happened, and how very rich Prince Ahmed was since his marriage with the fairy, richer than all the kings in the world, and how there was danger that he should come and take the throne from his father. Though the Sultan of the Indies was very well persuaded that Prince Ahmed's natural disposition was good, yet he could not help being concerned at the discourse of the old sorceress, to whom, when she was taking her leave, he said, "I thank thee for the pains thou hast taken, and thy wholesome advice. I am so sensible of the great importance it is to me that I shall deliberate upon it in council." Now, the favourites advised that the prince should be killed, but the magician advised differently. "Make him give you all kinds of wonderful things, by the fairy's help, till she tires of him and sends him away. As, for example, every time your majesty goes into the field, you are obliged to be at a great expense, not only in pavilions and tents for your army, but likewise in mules and camels to carry their baggage. Now, might not you engage him to use his interest with the fairy to procure you a tent, which might be carried in a man's hand, and which should be so large as to shelter your whole army against bad weather?" When the magician had finished her speech, The Sultan asked his favourites if they had anything better to propose, and, finding them all silent, determined to follow the magician's advice as the most reasonable and most agreeable to his mild government. Next day, the Sultan did as the magician had advised him and asked for the pavilion. Prince Ahmed never expected that the Sultan his father would have asked such a thing, which at first appeared so difficult, not to say impossible. Though he knew not absolutely how great the power of genies and fairies was, he doubted whether it extended so far as to compass such a tent as his father desired. At last he replied, "Though it is with the greatest reluctance imaginable, I will not fail to ask the favour of my wife your majesty desires, but will not promise you to obtain it. And if I should not have the honour to come again to pay you my respects, that shall be the sign that I have not had success. But beforehand, I desire you to forgive me, and consider that you yourself have reduced me to this extremity." "Son," replied the Sultan of the Indies, "I should be very sorry if what I ask of you should cause me the displeasure of never seeing you more. I find you don't know the power a husband has over a wife, and yours would show that her love to you was very indifferent if she, with the power she has of a fairy, should refuse you so trifling a request as this. I desire you to ask of her for my sake." The prince went back, and was very sad for fear of offending the fairy. She kept pressing him to tell her what was the matter, and at last he said, "Madam, you may have observed that hitherto I have been content with your love, and have never asked you any other favour. Consider then, I conjure you, that it is not I, but the Sultan, my father, who indiscreetly, or at least I think so, begs of you a pavilion large enough to shelter him, his court, and army from the violence of the weather, and which a man may carry in his hand. But remember, it is the Sultan, my father, asks this favour." "Prince," replied the fairy, smiling, "I am sorry that so small a matter should disturb you, and make you so uneasy as you appeared to me." Then the fairy sent for her treasurer, to whom, when she came, she said, "Noor-Jihan," which was her name, "bring me the largest pavilion in my treasury." Noor-Jihan returned presently with the pavilion, which she could not only hold in her hand, but in the palm of her hand when she shut her fingers, and presented it to her mistress, who gave it to Prince Ahmed to look at. When Prince Ahmed saw the pavilion, which the fairy called the largest in her treasury, he fancied she had a mind to jest with him, and thereupon the marks of his surprise appeared presently in his countenance, which Paribanu perceiving, burst out laughing. "What, Prince," cried she, "do you think I jest with you? You'll see presently that I am in earnest. Nourghan," said she to her treasurer, taking the tent out of Prince Ahmed's hands, "go and set it up, that the prince may judge whether it may be large enough for the Sultan his father." The treasurer went immediately with it out of the palace, and carried it a great way off, and when she had set it up, one end reached to the very palace, at which time the prince, thinking it small, found it large enough to shelter 2 greater armies than that of the Sultan, his father's, and then said to Paribanu, "I ask my princess 1,000 pardons for my incredulity. After what I have seen, I believe there is nothing impossible to you." "You see," said the fairy, "that the pavilion is larger than what your father may have occasion for you must know that it has one property, that it is larger or smaller according to the army. It is to cover." The treasurer took down the tent again, and brought it to the prince, who took it, and, without staying any longer than till the next day, mounted his horse, and went with the same attendants to the Sultan his father. The Sultan, who was persuaded that there could not be any such thing as such a tent as he asked for, was in a great surprise at the prince's diligence. He took the tent, and after he had admired its smallness, his amazement was so great that he could not recover himself. When the tent was set up in the great plain, which we have before mentioned, he found it large enough to shelter an army twice as large as he could bring into the field. But the Sultan was not yet satisfied. "Son," said he, "I have already expressed to you how much I am obliged to you for the present of the tent you have procured me, that I look upon it as the most valuable thing in all my treasury. But you must do one thing more for me, which will be every whit as agreeable to me. I am informed that the fairy, your spouse, makes use of a certain water, called the water of the Fountain of Lions, which cures all sorts of fevers, even the most dangerous. And as I am perfectly well persuaded my health is dear to you, I don't doubt but you will ask her for a bottle of that water for me, and bring it me as a sovereign medicine, which I may make use of when I have occasion. Do me this other important piece of service, and thereby complete the duty of a good son toward a tender father." The prince returned and told the fairy what his father had said. "There's a great deal of wickedness in this demand," she answered, "as you will understand by what I am going to tell you. The Fountain of Lions is situated in the middle of a court of a great castle, the entrance into which is guarded by 4 fierce lions, 2 of which sleep alternately, while the other 2 are awake. But don't let that frighten you. I'll give you means to pass by them without any danger." The fairy Paribanu was at that time very hard at work, and as she had several clues of thread by her, she took up one, and, presenting it to Prince Ahmed, said, "First take this clue of thread. I'll tell you presently the use of it. In the second place, you must have 2 horses. One you must ride yourself, and the other you must lead, which must be loaded with a sheep cut into 4 quarters that must be killed today. In the third place, you must be provided with a bottle, which I will give you, to bring the water in. Set out early tomorrow morning, and when you have passed the iron gate, throw the clue of thread before you, which will roll till it comes to the gates of the castle. Follow it, and when it stops, as the gates will be open, you will see the 4 lions. The 2 that are awake will, by their roaring, wake the other 2. But don't be frightened, but throw each of them a quarter of mutton, and then clap spurs to your horse and ride to the fountain. Fill your bottle without alighting, and then return with the same expedition. The lions will be so busy eating, they will let you pass by them." Prince Ahmed set out the next morning at the time appointed by the fairy, and followed her directions exactly. When he arrived at the gates of the castle, he distributed the quarters of mutton among the 4 lions, and, passing through the midst of them bravely, got to the fountain, filled his bottle, and returned back as safe and sound as he went. When he had gone a little distance from the castle gates, he turned him about, and, perceiving 2 of the lions coming after him, he drew his sabre and prepared himself for defence. But as he went forward, he saw one of them turned out of the road at some distance, and showed by his head and tail that he did not come to do him any harm, but only to go before him, and that the other stayed behind to follow. He put his sword up again in its scabbard. Guarded in this manner, he arrived at the capital of the Indies, but the lions never left him till they had conducted him to the gates of the Sultan's palace, after which they returned the same way they came, though not without frightening all that saw them, for all they went in a very gentle manner and showed no fierceness. A great many officers came to attend the prince while he dismounted his horse, and afterward conducted him into the Sultan's apartment, who was at that time surrounded with his favourites. He approached toward the throne, laid the bottle at the Sultan's feet, and kissed the rich tapestry which covered his footstool, and then said, "I have brought you, sir, the healthful water which your majesty desired so much to keep among your other rarities in your treasury, but at the same time wish you such extraordinary health as never to have occasion to make use of it. After the prince had made an end of his compliment, the Sultan placed him on his right hand and then said to him, "Son, I am very much obliged to you for this valuable present, as also for the great danger you have exposed yourself to upon my account, which I have been informed of by a magician who knows the Fountain of Lions. But do me the pleasure," continued he, "to inform me by what address, or rather by what incredible power, you have been secured." "Sir," replied Prince Ahmed, "I have no share in the compliment your majesty is pleased to make me. All the honor is due to the fairy, my spouse, whose good advice I followed." Then he informed the Sultan what those directions were, and by the relation of this his expedition let him know how well he had behaved himself. When he had done, the Sultan, who showed outwardly all the demonstrations of great joy, but secretly became more jealous, retired into an inward apartment where he sent for the magician. The magician, at her arrival, saved the Sultan the trouble to tell her of the success of Prince Ahmed's journey, which she had heard of before she came, and therefore was prepared with an infallible means, as she pretended. This means she communicated to the Sultan, who declared it the next day to the prince, in the midst of all his courtiers, in these words, "Son," said he, "I have one thing more to ask of you, after which I shall expect nothing more from your obedience, nor your interest with your wife. This request is, to bring me a man not above 1.5 feet high, and whose beard is 30 feet long, who carries a bar of iron upon his shoulders of 500 weight, which he uses as a quarterstaff." Prince Ahmed, who did not believe that there was such a man in the world as his father described, would gladly have excused himself, but the Sultan persisted in his demand, and told him the fairy could do more incredible things. The next day the prince returned to his dear Paribanu, to whom he told his father's new demand, which, he said, he looked upon to be a thing more impossible than the 2 first. "For," added he, "I cannot imagine there can be such a man in the world. Without doubt, he has a mind to try whether or no I am so silly as to go about it, or he has a design on my ruin. In short, how can he suppose that I should lay hold of a man so well armed, though he is but little? What arms can I make use of to reduce him to my will? If there are any means, I beg you will tell them, and let me come off with honor this time." "Don't affright yourself, Prince," replied the fairy. "You ran a risk in fetching the water of the Fountain of Lions for your father. But there's no danger in finding out this man, who is my brother Shaiba, but is so far from being like me, though we both had the same father, that he is of so violent a nature that nothing can prevent his giving cruel marks of his resentment for a slight offense. Yet, on the other hand, is so good as to oblige anyone in whatever they desire. He is made exactly as the Sultan your father has described him, and has no other arms than a bar of iron of 500 pounds weight, without which he never stirs, and which makes him respected. I'll send for him, and you shall judge of the truth of what I tell you. But be sure to prepare yourself against being frightened at his extraordinary figure when you see him." "What, my queen," replied Prince Ahmed, "do you say Shaiba is your brother? Let him be never so ugly or deformed, I shall be so far from being frightened at the sight of him that, as our brother, I shall honor and love him." The fairy ordered a gold chafing dish to be set with a fire in it under the porch of her palace, with a box of the same metal, which was a present to her, out of which, taking a perfume and throwing it into the fire, there arose a thick cloud of smoke. Some moments after, the fairy said to Prince Ahmed, "See, there comes my brother." The prince immediately perceived Shaiba coming gravely with his heavy bar on his shoulder, his long beard, which he held up before him, and a pair of thick mustachios, which he tucked behind his ears and almost covered his face. His eyes were very small and deep-set in his head, which was far from being of the smallest size, and on his head he wore a grenadier's cap. Besides all this, he was very much hump-backed. If Prince Ahmed had not known that Shaiba was Paribanu's brother, he would not have been able to have looked at him without fear. But, knowing first who he was, he stood by the fairy without the least concern. Shaiba, as he came forward, looked at the prince earnestly enough to have chilled his blood in his veins, and asked Paribanu, when he first accosted her, who that man was. To which she replied, "He is my husband, brother. His name is Ahmed. He is son to the Sultan of the Indies. The reason why I did not invite you to my wedding was I was unwilling to divert you from an expedition you were engaged in, and from which I heard with pleasure you returned victorious, and so took the liberty now to call for you." At these words Shaiba, looking on Prince Ahmed favourably, said, "Is there anything else, sister, wherein I can serve him? It is enough for me that he is your husband, to engage me to do for him whatever he desires." "The Sultan, his father," replied Paribanu, "has a curiosity to see you, and I desire he may be your guide to the Sultan's court. He needs but lead me the way, I'll follow him." "Brother," replied Paribanu, "it is too late to go today, therefore stay till tomorrow morning, and in the meantime I'll inform you of all that has passed between the Sultan of the Indies and Prince Ahmed since our marriage." The next morning, after Shaiba had been informed of the affair, he and Prince Ahmed set out for the Sultan's court. When they arrived at the gates of the capital, the people no sooner saw Shaiba, but they ran and hid themselves, and some shut up their shops and locked themselves up in their houses, while others, flying, communicated their fear to all they met, who stayed not to look behind them, but ran too, insomuch that Shaiba and Prince Ahmed, as they went along, found the streets all desolate, till they came to the palaces where the porters, instead of keeping the gates, ran away too, so that the prince and Shaiba advanced without any obstacle to the council hall, where the Sultan was seated on his throne and giving audience. Here likewise the ushers, at the approach of Shaiba, abandoned their posts and gave them free admittance. Shaiba went boldly and fiercely up to the throne, without waiting to be presented by Prince Ahmed, and accosted the Sultan of the Indies in these words. "Thou hast asked for me," said he. "See, here I am. What wouldst thou have with me?" The Sultan, instead of answering him, clapped his hands before his eyes to avoid the sight of so terrible an object, at which uncivil and rude reception Shaiba was so much provoked, after he had given him the trouble to come so far, that he instantly lifted up his iron bar and killed him before Prince Ahmed could intercede in his behalf. All that he could do was to prevent his killing the Grand Vizier, who sat not far from him, representing to him that he had always given the Sultan his father good advice. "These are they, then," said Shaiba, who gave him bad, and as he pronounced these words, he killed all the other viziers and flattering favourites of the Sultan who were Prince Ahmed's enemies. Every time he struck, he killed someone or other, and none escaped, but they who were not so frightened as to stand staring and gaping, and who saved themselves by flight. When this terrible execution was over, Shaiba came out of the council hall into the midst of the courtyard with the iron bar upon his shoulder, and, looking hard at the Grand Vizier, who owed his life to Prince Ahmed, he said, "I know here is a certain magician, who is a greater enemy of my brother-in-law than all these base favourites I have chastised. Let the magician be brought to me presently." The Grand Vizier immediately sent for her, and as soon as she was brought, Shaiba said, at the time he fetched a stroke at her with his iron bar, "Take the reward of thy pernicious counsel, and learn to feign sickness again." After this he said, "This is not yet enough. I will use the whole town after the same manner if they do not immediately acknowledge Prince Ahmed, my brother-in-law, for their sultan and the sultan of the Indies." Then all that were there present made the air echo again with the repeated acclamations of "Long life to Sultan Ahmed," and immediately after he was proclaimed through the whole town. Shaibar made him be clothed in the royal vestments, installed him on the throne, and after he had caused all to swear homage and fidelity to him, went and fetched his sister Paribanu, whom he brought with all the pomp and grandeur imaginable, and made her to be owned Sultaness of the Indies. As for Prince Ali and Princess Nouronihar, as they had no hand in the conspiracy against Prince Ahmed and knew nothing of any, Prince Ahmed assigned them a considerable province with its capital, where they spent the rest of their lives. Afterwards he sent an officer to Prince Hussein to acquaint him with the change, and make him an offer of which province he liked best. But that prince thought himself so happy in his solitude that he bade the officer return the Sultan, his brother, thanks for the kindness he designed him, assuring him of his submission, and that the only favour he desired of him was to give him leave to live retired in the place he had made choice of for his retreat,